It was a dreary evening in Silverbrook, the kind where the rain blurred the lines of the familiar streets and cast the small town in a dim, muted haze. The wind carried a sharp chill, biting through the threadbare coat Emma Carter wore as she hurried home from her late shift at Dinah's Diner. Her sneakers slapped against the wet pavement, splashing cold water onto her already soaked jeans. She clutched her bag tightly, the day's tips jingling faintly, a meager sum that would barely dent her mounting bills. But Emma was used to the weight of struggle. At 29, she had weathered far more than many in this sleepy town. As she turned onto Maple Avenue, her mind wandered to her nursing classes, which she attended 3 nights a week after work. She'd always dreamed of becoming a nurse, but dreams felt like luxuries when survival demanded every ounce of her strength. She barely noticed the figure lying on the sidewalk until she was almost upon it. At first, she thought it was a pile of trash, discarded and drenched by the relentless rain, but as she drew closer, her breath hitched. A man, motionless and pale, sprawled across the ground, his expensive suit drenched and clinging to his body. His face was faintly illuminated by the flickering glow of a nearby street lamp. "Sir?" Emma's voice wavered as she knelt beside him, her heart pounding against her ribs. She reached out, shaking his shoulder gently. He didn't respond. Panic surged in her chest, but years of taking care of her mother during her long illness had given Emma a practical instinct in emergencies. She checked his pulse, faint but there, and tilted his head back, assessing his airway. The man wasn't breathing. "Oh, God," she whispered, her voice trembling as she placed her hands on his chest and began compressions. The rain lashed at her face, soaking her hair and trickling down her neck, but she didn't falter. "Stay with me," she muttered under her breath, her hands pressing rhythmically. The street lamp buzzed and flickered, casting eerie shadows over the scene. Her mind raced as she worked, the sound of her own breathing loud in her ears. Where had he come from? How long had he been lying here? Silverbrook wasn't the kind of place where people collapsed unnoticed, but the storm had driven most indoors. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man gasped sharply, his body convulsing. Emma leaned back, relief washing over her. "You're okay," she said, though he clearly wasn't. His eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing a striking shade of grey before they closed again. His breath was shallow, but at least he was alive. The wail of approaching sirens broke through the rain's relentless patter, and Emma exhaled shakily. She hadn't even realized someone had called for help. Moments later, paramedics spilled out of an ambulance, their practiced movements taking over as they assessed the man's condition and loaded him onto a stretcher. "Do you know him?" one of them asked, a young woman with a kind face and a no-nonsense tone. Emma shook her head, brushing a wet strand of hair from her face. "No, I just found him here." "You saved his life," the paramedic said, her voice tinged with admiration. But Emma only nodded numbly, stepping back as the medics closed the ambulance doors and sped off into the night, their red and blue lights reflecting off the rain-slicked streets. She stood there for a moment, shivering as the adrenaline began to fade. The town was quiet again, save for the steady rhythm of the rain. A sense of unreality hung over her. Who was he, and what had happened to him? Emma glanced down at her trembling hands, still red and raw from the CPR. She had done what she could. As she turned to head home, she whispered to herself, "Just doing my duty," though the words rang hollow. Something about the man, his aura of wealth, his vulnerability in that moment, left an unease she couldn't quite shake. She didn't know that her life and his had just changed forever. The rain had eased by the time Emma reached her small apartment on the edge of Silverbrook, though her clothes were still plastered to her skin. She set her bag on the worn kitchen counter, the familiar scent of damp wood filling the tiny space. The dim light above the sink buzzed faintly, casting long shadows over the peeling linoleum floor. Emma peeled off her soaked jacket and hung it over the back of a chair, her thoughts still circling the man she had found lying unconscious on the street. It wasn't like her to linger on strangers. Life had taught her to keep her head down and focus on her own battles. But the image of his face, pale and stark under the flickering street lamp, refused to leave her mind. Who was he? What had brought him to Silverbrook, a town so ordinary it rarely welcomed anyone from beyond its quiet borders? Her fingers traced the edge of the cracked countertop as she leaned against it, staring out the window at the now drizzling rain. In the distance, the faint glow of the diner's neon sign flickered like a weak heartbeat. Emma had grown up here, in this very town, surrounded by its quiet streets and modest homes. It was all she had ever known. Her late mother, Sarah, had often called Silverbrook a safe haven, though Emma couldn't remember a time when life had ever felt truly safe. Sarah had worked herself to exhaustion, trying to keep a roof over their heads after Emma's father left when she was only 7 years old. The memories of her mother's final years, frail and bedridden, her once strong voice reduced to faint whispers, clung to Emma like a shadow. It was the medical bills from those years that still weighed heavily on Emma's shoulders. She worked double shifts at the diner, juggling trays of coffee and greasy plates with the kind of efficiency born from necessity, not choice. When the sun went down, she transformed into a student, poring over textbooks and medical diagrams at the town library, dreaming of the day she could wear scrubs and help others in a way she couldn't help her own mother. "Maybe someday," she murmured to herself, the words hollow yet familiar. They were the same ones she had whispered countless times in the dead of night, willing herself to believe that brighter days were ahead. The shrill ring of her phone snapped her out of her thoughts. She reached for it, her hands still trembling faintly from the night's adrenaline. The name Lily flashed on the screen, and Emma allowed herself a small smile before answering. "Hey, Em," came Lily's bright voice on the other end. "You okay? You sounded weird when you texted earlier." Emma hesitated. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just had a strange night." "Strange how?" Lily pressed. "Did old Mr. Hargrove finally propose after his 10th cup of coffee?" Despite herself, Emma laughed softly. "No, nothing like that. I found someone on the street." He wasn't breathing. There was a pause, and Emma could picture Lily's wide eyes as she processed the words. "Wait, what? Are you serious? What happened?" Emma recounted the night's events, her voice steady but low, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile thread of her own composure. She told Lily about the man's lifeless body, the rain soaking through his expensive suit, the desperate CPR she had performed until the paramedics arrived. "Wow," Lily breathed when Emma finished. "That's intense. Do you know who he was?" "No idea," Emma admitted. "But he looked like he didn't belong here. Not in a place like Silverbrook." "Well, you're a hero, Em. You saved his life. Maybe he's some rich guy who'll shower you with diamonds as a thank you." Emma rolled her eyes, though a flicker of curiosity tugged at her. The man's suit had been finely tailored, his watch gleaming even under the dim streetlight. He didn't seem like someone who would have any reason to be in Silverbrook, let alone lying unconscious on its rain-soaked streets. "Sure," Emma said dryly, "and maybe I'll wake up tomorrow with a winning lottery ticket under my pillow." Lily laughed. "You never know." Stranger things have happened. They chatted a while longer, their conversation drifting to lighter topics, the latest drama at the diner, the upcoming charity bake sale at the community center, until Emma felt her eyelids growing heavy. She bid Lily goodnight and hung up, her small apartment falling silent once more. Climbing into bed, Emma pulled the thin quilt up to her chin, the distant hum of passing cars lulling her into a restless sleep. Yet even as her body surrendered to exhaustion, her mind refused to let go of the night's events, The man's face, ghostly pale and marked by a fleeting expression of pain, lingered in the corners of her dreams. Unbeknownst to her, across town in Silverbrook's small hospital, the man lay in a sterile room, monitors beeping steadily around him. The nurses whispered about his sudden arrival, his expensive clothes, and the mystery surrounding his identity. One of them tucked a blanket around his still form, unaware that his waking thoughts, when they came, would begin a search for the woman who had saved his life. In the stark quiet of a hospital room, James Caldwell stirred, his consciousness clawing its way through a fog thick with fragmented images. The rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor tethered him to reality, its steady cadence a sharp contrast to the disarray within his mind. His body ached, every muscle heavy with the effort of waking. The faint scent of antiseptic tickled his senses, and he opened his eyes to the harsh glow of fluorescent lights overhead. "Mr. Caldwell," a calm voice broke through his haze. A nurse, middle-aged with warm eyes and a professional demeanor, stepped closer, her clipboard in hand. "Can you hear me?" James's throat was dry, his voice a rasp. "Yes. Where am I?" "You're at Silverbrook General Hospital." "You were brought in unconscious last night," she explained, her tone kind but matter-of-fact. "You had a cardiac episode, but someone performed CPR and saved your life before the paramedics arrived." A frown creased his forehead. His memories were a jigsaw puzzle, the pieces scattered and mismatched. He struggled to remember anything beyond the cold rain and the sensation of air forcing its way back into his lungs. Flashes of a woman's face surfaced, a silhouette framed by the glow of a street lamp, her hands steady, her voice urging him to hold on. But the details were slippery, retreating just as he tried to grasp them. "Who?" His voice cracked, and he winced at the rawness in his throat. "Who saved me?" The nurse shook her head. "We don't know. She left before we arrived, but from what we've gathered, she may have saved your life. You're very lucky." Lucky. The word felt hollow as James shifted in the hospital bed, his limbs leaden and his head heavy. He blinked at the unfamiliar surroundings, the white walls and sterile atmosphere far removed from the luxury he was accustomed to. Even in his disoriented state, he knew this place was unlike the private hospitals he frequented in New York or Los Angeles. It was smaller, humbler, a place for those who had few options. As the nurse adjusted the IV line in his arm, James tried to piece together the fragments of his memory. The last clear thought he could recall was driving into Silverbrook for a meeting, something about a land deal. After that, everything dissolved into a blur of rain, cold, and a persistent sense of urgency. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a man in a tailored suit, his polished shoes incongruous against the hospital's worn linoleum floors. The man's sharp features and impeccably styled hair marked him as someone used to command and efficiency. He approached the bed with measured steps, his expression a mix of concern and relief. "James," he said, his voice firm but edged with tension. "It's good to see you awake. You had us all worried." James squinted, recognition dawning slowly. "Elliot?" "Yes, sir." "I came as soon as I heard." Elliot Price, James's longtime assistant and the gatekeeper of his meticulously controlled life, set a briefcase on the nearby chair and surveyed him critically. "You've had quite the scare. The doctors say it was stress-induced, a cardiac arrest brought on by overwork and exhaustion." James let out a dry laugh, though it lacked humor. "That sounds about right." Elliot hesitated, his professional veneer slipping for a moment. "Do you remember why you were in Silverbrook?" James closed his eyes, his brow furrowing as he tried to dredge up the details. "The land deal," he said slowly. "I was supposed to meet someone about a property." Elliot nodded. "You were here to look into a parcel of land on the outskirts of town, but before the meeting, your car was found parked on the side of the road, and you were well, collapsed a few blocks away. We're still trying to piece together what happened. James's mind snagged on the image of the woman again, a fleeting memory of her determination as she fought to keep him alive. The person who saved me. Do we know anything about her? Not yet, Elliot admitted, his tone cautious. But I can make some inquiries. If she's local, someone here will know her. Do it, James said, his voice firm despite his fatigue. I want to find her. Elliot's brow furrowed slightly, but he nodded. Of course. As the nurse returned to check James's vitals, Elliot stepped aside, his phone already in hand as he began making calls. James lay back against the pillows, his thoughts consumed by the mystery of the woman who had saved him. Gratitude mingled with a strange sense of restlessness. He had faced near death before, business risks, personal losses, but this was different. This was a moment he hadn't controlled, a debt he couldn't repay until he knew more. The beeping of the monitor filled the silence as James stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. Somewhere in this quiet town, a stranger had knelt beside him in the rain and given him a second chance. He vowed to find her, not yet understanding how that vow would upend both of their lives. Back in her modest apartment, Emma Carter carried on with her daily routine, though the events of the previous evening lingered in her thoughts. The narrow space, with its mismatched furniture and a second-hand lamp that cast a warm glow over the room, felt like a sanctuary to her. She sat at her small table, a worn nursing textbook open in front of her, and tried to focus on the diagrams of human anatomy. But the memory of the unconscious man kept intruding, his pale face and faint pulse etched into her mind like a lingering question. Emma had shared the story with Lily over the phone, but now, with the quiet of the apartment pressing in around her, the weight of it seemed heavier. What kind of man wore a suit that expensive, yet ended up collapsed in the rain in a place like Silverbrook? The thought nagged at her as she sipped a cup of tea, her favorite mug warming her hands. Life in Silverbrook was rarely dramatic, and Emma had spent most of her life keeping her head down, content to go unnoticed. But now, a seed of curiosity had been planted, one she couldn't quite ignore. Her shift at the diner later that day passed without much incident, though the regulars noticed her slight distraction. Old Mr. Hargrove, who came in every evening for his slice of apple pie, squinted at her from behind his thick glasses. "You're quieter than usual today, Emma," he remarked as she poured him a coffee refill. "Something on your mind?" Emma smiled politely. "Just a long night, Mr. Hargrove. Nothing a good night's sleep won't fix." He nodded sagely, though she could feel his watchful eyes on her as she moved to the next table. The town's residents were a close-knit bunch, their lives intertwined by years of shared history. It was comforting in some ways, but stifling in others, a constant reminder that secrets rarely stayed buried for long in Silverbrook. After her shift, Emma headed to the library for her usual evening of studying. The old building, with its creaking floors and rows of bookshelves, had been her refuge since she was a child. As she settled into her favorite corner, she thought again of the man she had saved. Maybe Lily was right, she mused with a faint smile. He might indeed turn out to be some kind of millionaire. Not that it mattered. Emma wasn't the type to expect gratitude, let alone anything more. "Emma, there you are!" Lily's voice interrupted her thoughts. Emma looked up to see her best friend weaving through the shelves, her fiery red hair and lively expression standing out against the muted tones of the library. "Shh," Emma teased, gesturing to the quiet zone sign nearby. "What are you doing here?" Lily plopped into the chair across from her, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "I came to see you, obviously. I couldn't stop thinking about that mystery man of yours. You've got to admit, it's exciting. A millionaire in Silverbrook. Who'd have thought?" Emma shook her head, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "You're jumping to conclusions." "He could be anyone." "Please," Lily scoffed, leaning closer. "Normal people don't collapse in designer suits. I'm telling you, he's someone important. Maybe a businessman or a politician. Who knows? You might have saved someone famous." "Even if I did," Emma said, closing her textbook, "it doesn't change anything. He's gone, and I'm back to studying for exams and working double shifts. End of story." But Lily wasn't so easily deterred. "You're too modest, Em. You did something incredible. People are going to talk when they find out." Emma frowned, her brow furrowing slightly. "I hope not. I don't want attention, Lily. I just want to get through my classes and—" She stopped short, the words feeling heavy even as she spoke them. "And what?" The question lingered in the air, unspoken but persistent. Lily tilted her head, her playful smile softening. "You deserve more than this, you know. You've always been the one taking care of everyone else. Maybe it's time someone took care of you for a change." Emma opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. She loved Lily for her optimism, even if it sometimes clashed with her own practicality. But deep down, a small part of her wanted to believe her friend was right. That maybe, just maybe, there was something more waiting for her beyond the borders of Silverbrook. As they left the library together, the evening air was crisp and the sky above was dotted with stars. Emma looked up, her breath forming small clouds in the chill. "Thanks for stopping by," she said, her voice softer now. "I needed the distraction." Lily grinned, looping her arm through Emma's. "Any time. And hey, if you ever find out who he is, you'd better tell me first. I need all the juicy details." Emma laughed, shaking her head. "Don't hold your breath." They parted ways at the corner of Maple Avenue, and Emma walked the rest of the way home alone. The quiet streets felt different tonight, as if the town itself was holding its breath. She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the stack of bills waiting on her kitchen counter and the exam she needed to prepare for. Life went on, as it always did. Still, as she climbed into bed, the memory of the man's face flickered in her mind, a puzzle piece that refused to fit. Somewhere out there, he was recovering, and Emma told herself that was enough. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that their paths weren't quite done crossing. It was late afternoon when Emma returned home from another long shift at the diner. The autumn air had grown cooler, and the trees along Maple Avenue were beginning to shed their fiery red and orange leaves, blanketing the sidewalks in a carpet of color. Emma carried her books and purse in one arm and juggled a small bag of groceries in the other. She felt the weight of her routine, the endless loop of work, study, and sleep, pressing down on her shoulders more heavily than usual. As she reached her apartment, the mailbox on the ground floor caught her eye. She didn't check it often, knowing it rarely held anything but bills and junk flyers. Still, she paused, balancing her bags as she pulled open the small metal door. Inside, amid the usual advertisements and envelopes with bold, demanding print, was a heavy, cream-colored envelope. Her name was scrawled across the front in elegant script. Emma frowned, setting down her bags to examine the envelope more closely. There was no return address, just her name and address, written with precision. The paper felt expensive under her fingertips, unlike anything she was used to. A sense of unease prickled at her as she carefully opened it, revealing a neatly folded letter and an official-looking document tucked inside. Her eyes scanned the letter, the words sinking in slowly, their meaning striking like a cold gust of wind. The letterhead bore the name of a prominent law firm in New York City. It informed her that she was being summoned to court in connection with an incident involving James Caldwell. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she read on, learning that James Caldwell, was the name of the man she had saved. The letter stated he was a real estate developer, one of the wealthiest in the country, in fact, and that there was an ongoing legal dispute surrounding the circumstances of his accident. Emma sank onto the bottom step of the staircase, the letter clutched in her hand. For a moment, the world seemed to blur around her. She had thought little about the man after that night, believing she would never hear of him again. Now, not only did she know his name, but she was also being dragged into something far larger than she could have imagined. As she reread the letter, her mind raced with questions. Why was she being called to court? She had no involvement in the man's affairs beyond saving his life. And what could someone like James Caldwell, a man with unimaginable wealth and influence, possibly want from her? Her phone buzzed in her purse, startling her from her thoughts. She retrieved it with fumbling hands, seeing Lily's name flash on the screen. Taking a deep breath, she answered. "Hey, Em, you won't believe this," Lily began, her voice bright and excitable as always, but she stopped abruptly. "What's wrong? You sound off." Emma hesitated, clutching the letter tightly. "I just got some strange news. Remember the man I told you about, the one I saved?" "Of course," Lily said, her tone immediately serious. "What happened? Did you hear from him?" "Not exactly," Emma replied, glancing around the dim hallway as if someone might be listening. "I got a letter from a lawyer. Apparently, he's some big-shot millionaire named James Caldwell, and now I'm being called to court because of his accident." There was a beat of silence on the line before Lily burst out, Wait. You're telling me that the guy you saved is a millionaire, like an actual millionaire?" "That's what the letter says," Emma said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "But I don't understand why I'm involved in any of this. All I did was help him." "Well, that explains the fancy suit," Lily said, though her usual humor was tempered by concern. "What are you going to do?" Emma let out a long sigh, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "I don't know. I guess I'll have to go. It's not like I can just ignore a court summons." "Do you want me to come with you?" Lily offered. "You don't have to face this alone." Emma smiled faintly, touched by her friend's support. "Thanks, but I think I'll be okay. I just need to figure out what this is all about." They spoke a little longer before Emma ended the call, promising to keep Lily updated. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, the letter tucked under her arm, a mix of dread and curiosity settled over her. The idea of stepping into a courtroom, of facing someone like James Caldwell and whatever chaos surrounded him, felt surreal. Her life in Silverbrook was so far removed from his world of skyscrapers and boardrooms that the two seemed like different universes entirely. Inside her apartment, she sat at her small kitchen table, the unopened document from the envelope lying in front of her. After a moment's hesitation, she unfolded it. It was a formal subpoena, summoning her to testify about the events of the night she saved James Caldwell. The date was 2 weeks away, giving her little time to prepare or process what lay ahead. Emma rested her head in her hands, the enormity of it all sinking in. She had only done what any decent person would do, what her mother had always taught her to do, and yet that single act of kindness had pulled her into a world she had no desire to enter. As the evening wore on, Emma tried to focus on her studies, but her mind was restless. She thought of James Caldwell, his life so far removed from her own, and wondered what kind of man he truly was. A millionaire. Yes, but beyond that, he was still a mystery. One thing was certain: her life in Silverbrook was about to change in ways she could never have anticipated. The courtroom had the kind of hushed tension that seemed to amplify every small noise. The shuffle of papers, the creak of leather chairs, and the occasional murmur from the gathered spectators. Emma Carter sat on the edge of the witness bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. The formal setting, with its dark wood paneling and rows of somber faces, was far removed from the humble streets of Silverbrook. She couldn't help but feel as if she had been plucked from her simple life and placed on a stage where she didn't belong. James Caldwell sat across the room, flanked by a team of sharply dressed lawyers. His presence was striking, commanding attention without any overt effort. Though he wore a tailored navy suit, his expression held a subdued intensity, as if he, too, felt the weight of the moment. His eyes rested on Emma with an unspoken recognition, though she avoided meeting his gaze. "Miss Carter," the opposing attorney began, his voice measured and courteous, but with an underlying sharpness. "Could you please recount, in your own words, what you witnessed the night of the incident?" Emma nodded, her throat dry despite the glass of water placed in front of her. She took a deep breath, willing herself to speak clearly. "I was walking home from work. It was late, and it had been raining heavily. That's when I saw him, Mr. Caldwell, on the ground. At first, I thought—" She paused, glancing briefly at James before continuing. "I thought he might have just fallen, but then I realized he wasn't breathing. I called for help and started CPR until the paramedics arrived." Her words were simple and factual, but the memory of that night flooded back in vivid detail. The cold rain soaking her clothes, the desperation as she worked to revive him, and the eerie stillness of the street. It all felt as close as yesterday. "And you had no prior knowledge of who Mr. Caldwell was?" the attorney pressed, his tone polite but probing. "No," Emma replied firmly. "I didn't know him. I still don't, really." From his seat, James shifted slightly, his grey eyes studying her with an intensity she could feel even without looking at him directly. The attorney nodded, seemingly satisfied with her response, and stepped back. For a moment, the air in the room seemed to ease, but it didn't last long. Now it was the turn of James's lead lawyer, a woman with a commanding presence and a voice that carried an air of quiet authority. "Miss Carter," she began, "thank you for your bravery that night. It's no exaggeration to say you saved Mr. Caldwell's life. Were you aware of the risks involved in performing CPR?" Emma blinked, caught off guard by the shift in tone. "I wasn't really thinking about risks," she admitted. "I just knew I had to do something. I couldn't just leave him there." The lawyer offered a faint smile, one of appreciation rather than triumph. "Your actions were admirable, Miss Carter. Few people would have acted as decisively as you did under those circumstances." Emma shifted uncomfortably under the unexpected praise. She wasn't accustomed to being the center of attention, and the weight of so many eyes on her felt suffocating. But there was no malice in the lawyer's questions, only a genuine acknowledgement of her actions. As the questioning continued, Emma noticed James watching her closely, his expression a mix of gratitude and something she couldn't quite place. When the lawyers finally finished, she was allowed to step down, her legs shaky as she returned to her seat among the modest crowd of observers. The proceedings dragged on, with legal jargon and evidence being presented that Emma barely understood. She learned bits and pieces about the events leading up to James's accident, his business dealings in Silverbrook, the disputes over land ownership, but much of it felt distant, unrelated to her own small role in the story. When the court adjourned for a recess, Emma stood to leave, eager to escape the stifling atmosphere. As she gathered her belongings, she heard a voice behind her, low and measured. "Miss Carter!" She turned, and there he was, James Caldwell, towering slightly above her and radiating an air of quiet authority. Up close, he was even more striking, with silver threads woven into his dark hair and a demeanor that spoke of a life accustomed to control. But there was something else in his expression, something softer that caught her off guard. "Mr. Caldwell, she said, her voice steady despite the sudden flutter in her chest. I hope you're feeling better. I am, thanks to you, he replied, his tone sincere. I owe you more than I can say. Emma waved off the sentiment awkwardly. You don't owe me anything. Anyone would have done the same. I'm not so sure about that, James said, his lips curving into a faint smile. I don't meet many people who act without expecting something in return. The words hung between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the gulf between their lives. Emma didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded and stepped past him, feeling the weight of his gaze as she walked away. Outside the courthouse, the cool autumn air filled her lungs, a welcome reprieve from the stifling tension inside. But as she made her way back to Silverbrook, she couldn't shake the feeling that her encounter with James Caldwell was only the beginning of something far more complicated than she could have imagined. The following morning, Emma rose early, the events of the previous day still swirling in her mind. The courtroom, the pointed questions, and James Caldwell's intense gaze lingered with her as she made her way to the diner. She wanted nothing more than to slip back into the comfort of her routine, the steady rhythm of serving coffee and chatting with regulars. But as she tied her apron behind her back, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, though she couldn't yet name what it was. By mid-morning, the diner was bustling, the clink of dishes and hum of conversation filling the air. Emma moved quickly between tables, refilling cups and jotting down orders, grateful for the distraction. She had just placed a fresh pot of coffee on the counter when the bell above the door jingled. Turning instinctively, she froze. There, standing in the doorway, was James Caldwell. His tailored coat, dark and unassuming, somehow made him seem even more out of place in the small-town diner. The chatter in the room softened as heads turned to take in the newcomer, his polished presence a stark contrast to the comfortable familiarity of Silverbrook's residence. James scanned the room until his eyes settled on Emma. He offered a small, almost apologetic smile before stepping forward. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low but warm, "I hope I'm not interrupting." Emma's cheeks flushed, and she quickly set the coffee pot down, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Caldwell," she replied, her voice tinged with surprise, "this is unexpected." "I owe you an apology," he said, his expression earnest. "Yesterday at the courthouse, I didn't get a proper chance to thank you. May I have a moment of your time?" Emma glanced around the diner, acutely aware of the curious stares from the regulars. Old Mr. Hargrove, seated at his usual spot by the window, raised his bushy eyebrows in silent inquiry. Emma forced a polite smile and gestured toward a quieter booth in the corner. As they sat down, James leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "I know this must be overwhelming for you," he began. "It's not every day someone like me shows up in a place like this." Emma folded her hands in her lap, her eyes steady on his. "You're right, it's not, but I didn't save you for recognition or gratitude, Mr. Caldwell. I just did what I thought was right." "I believe you," James said, his voice soft but resolute, "and that's what makes you remarkable." Emma blinked, taken aback by the sincerity in his tone. She had expected him to be distant or dismissive, perhaps even condescending, but there was none of that in his demeanor. Instead, he seemed genuinely humbled, as if the scales of power and privilege had tilted, if only slightly. "I wanted to thank you properly," he continued, "and to offer you something in return." Emma's brows knitted together, her instincts on alert. "I don't want anything from you, Mr. Caldwell. I'm not looking for a reward." "It's not a reward," James assured her. "It's an opportunity. I run a charitable foundation that supports education and healthcare initiatives. After hearing about your nursing studies, I thought you might be interested in joining our team." We could use someone with your skills and your compassion. Emma's heart skipped a beat. The offer was unexpected, and for a moment, it sounded almost too good to be true. But a lifetime of hard-earned skepticism quickly tempered her initial reaction. She straightened in her seat, her voice measured. "That's very generous of you, but why me? I'm just a waitress from Silverbrook." "I'm not exactly qualified to work for someone like you. You're exactly the kind of person we need," James said, his gaze steady. "Someone who understands what it means to put others first. And from what I've seen, you're far more capable than you give yourself credit for." Emma hesitated, her thoughts racing. The idea of leaving Silverbrook, of stepping into a world she barely understood, was both thrilling and terrifying. Yet there was a part of her, a small, hopeful part, that wanted to believe his words, to trust that she could be more than what her circumstances had allowed. But doubt lingered, sharp and insistent. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully, "but I need time to think about it." "Of course," James said, his tone understanding. "Take all the time you need. If you decide to accept, my assistant, Elliot, will handle all the details." Emma nodded, her mind still clouded with uncertainty. As James rose to leave, he reached into his coat pocket and placed a small business card on the table. "No pressure," he said with a faint smile, "but I hope you'll consider it." She watched as he left the diner, the door closing softly behind him. The room buzzed back to life, the other patrons resuming their conversations, but Emma felt as if the world had tilted slightly off its axis. She stared at the card in front of her, the elegant lettering spelling out James Caldwell's name and contact information, and felt the weight of his offer pressing down on her. Lily arrived at the diner shortly after, her eyes lighting up as she spotted Emma in the corner booth. "What's that look on your face?" she asked, sliding into the seat across from her. Emma sighed, holding up the card. "James Caldwell just offered me a job." Lily's jaw dropped, and her voice rose in excitement. "You're kidding! That's amazing, Em! What kind of job?" "Something at his foundation," Emma said, her tone guarded. "But I don't know, Lily. It feels complicated." "Complicated?" Lily scoffed. "This is your chance, Emma. You've spent your whole life stuck in this town, taking care of everyone else. Maybe it's time to do something for yourself." Emma looked down at the card again, her fingers tracing the embossed letters. She wanted to believe Lily was right, but deep down, she couldn't shake the fear of stepping into the unknown. The days that followed James Caldwell's unexpected visit to the diner brought more attention than Emma was accustomed to or comfortable with. Word had spread quickly through Silverbrook about the mysterious millionaire and his meeting with the town's unassuming waitress. While some praised Emma for her bravery in saving a stranger's life, others gossiped about what James might truly want from her. Emma, meanwhile, kept her head down, trying to make sense of the choices laid before her. By the end of the week, Lily convinced her to take a break from the constant whispers and judgmental glances. They met at their usual spot by the riverbank, a quiet place where they had spent countless afternoons growing up. The leaves were falling steadily now, a mosaic of orange, yellow, and brown carpeting the ground. Emma watched the gentle ripples in the water, trying to calm the unease that had taken root inside her. "I still can't believe you're hesitating," Lily said, breaking the silence. She tossed a small stone into the river, watching it skip once before sinking. "If I were you, I'd have packed my bags the second he offered." Emma smiled faintly, but her hands were knotted in her lap. "It's not that simple, Lily. What if this isn't the right choice? What if I leave and fail?" "You won't fail," Lily said firmly, sitting down beside her. "You've been through harder things, Em. You've taken care of yourself for years, working jobs that most people wouldn't last a week in. If anyone can handle a challenge, it's you." Emma glanced at her friend, touched by her confidence but still wary. And what if people think I'm taking advantage of him? What if they think I'm just another person looking for a handout? Lily scoffed. Who cares what people think? Let them talk. The truth is, you deserve this chance. You've spent so much of your life worrying about everyone else. But this could be your moment, Em. You can't let fear hold you back. Emma let out a long sigh, her gaze fixed on the river. She wanted to believe Lily, to trust that this was the opportunity she had been waiting for. But a lifetime of struggle had made her cautious, wary of anything that seemed too good to be true. Her thoughts were interrupted when a familiar voice called her name from across the park. She turned to see Mr. Davenport, the elderly librarian, making his way toward them with surprising agility for his age. His tweed jacket and matching hat made him look like a character from an old English novel, and his kind smile instantly put Emma at ease. "Miss Carter," he said, tipping his hat. "I was hoping I might find you here. May I have a word?" "Of course, Mr. Davenport," Emma said, standing to greet him. Lily gave her a teasing wink and wandered off to give them privacy. "Mr." Davenport rested his hands on his cane, his sharp blue eyes studying her with a mix of curiosity and concern. "I heard about your visitor earlier this week," he began. "Quite the to-do for a small town like ours." Emma nodded, bracing herself for the usual questions or, worse, unsolicited advice. But Mr. Davenport's tone softened as he continued. "I don't pretend to know this James Caldwell," he said, "but I do know you. And I know you've always done right by the people in this town, even when it wasn't easy. That's a rare quality, Miss Carter, and one that shouldn't be overlooked." Emma was taken aback by his words, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," she said quietly, "but I'm not sure what to do. His world feels so different from mine. I don't know if I belong there." "Belonging is a curious thing," Mr. Davenport mused, tapping his cane lightly against the ground. "It's not about where you come from or what you have. It's about what you bring to the table. And if this man sees something in you, something worth inviting into his world, then perhaps you should trust that." Emma blinked, the weight of his words settling over her. She had spent so much time questioning herself, doubting her worth, that the idea of someone like James Caldwell recognizing her potential felt almost impossible to believe. "Just think on it," Mr. Davenport said with a kind smile. "And remember, it's not every day someone gets a chance to change their life." As he walked away, Emma returned to the riverbank, her mind racing with possibilities. Lily rejoined her, raising an eyebrow at her thoughtful expression. "What did he say?" Emma shook her head, still processing. "He thinks I should consider the offer." Lily grinned. "Well, there you have it. Mr. Davenport is the wisest man in Silverbrook. If he thinks it's a good idea, you'd better listen." Emma laughed softly, though the knot of uncertainty in her chest hadn't quite loosened. She spent the rest of the afternoon with Lily, their conversation drifting to lighter topics, but the weight of her decision lingered in the back of her mind. That evening, as she sat in her small apartment, the business card James had left stared up at her from the kitchen table. She picked it up, running her thumb over the embossed lettering. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to leave Silverbrook, to step into a world so different from her own. It was terrifying, yes, but also exhilarating. Emma placed the card back on the table, her resolve beginning to take shape. Whatever decision she made, it wouldn't come from fear. It would come from the quiet certainty that she was ready for something more. For the first time in years, Emma felt a flicker of hope that her life might hold possibilities she had never dared to dream of before. The decision weighed on Emma like a heavy winter coat, its presence constant and unrelenting. Days passed in a blur of work, study, and restless nights, each one underscored by the growing tension of her unresolved choice. The business card sat on her kitchen table, a small but persistent reminder of James Caldwell's offer. It was impossible to ignore, even when she wanted nothing more than to bury herself in the comforting routines of Silverbrook. At the diner, whispers followed her as she moved between tables. The town's residents, kind as they often were, couldn't resist speculating about Emma's connection to the wealthy stranger who had graced their sleepy little town. Some admired her bravery in saving him, while others, less charitable, wondered aloud if she had plans to leverage her newfound connection for personal gain. "You're becoming quite the celebrity, Em," Lily teased one afternoon as they sat on the back steps of the diner during a rare lull in the day. She bit into a crisp apple, her smile playful. "Next thing you know, they'll name a sandwich after you." Emma gave a faint laugh, but her expression was distracted. "I didn't ask for any of this, Lily. I just want to live my life without feeling like I'm under a microscope." Lily nudged her gently. "You can't let people's opinions control you. They'll talk no matter what you do, so you might as well do what's right for you." Emma sighed, the weight of her thoughts pulling her shoulders down. "It's not just what they think, it's what this could mean for me. If I say yes, it's not just a job, it's a complete upheaval of everything I know. And if I say no..." She trailed off, the fear of regret gnawing at her. Lily leaned back against the wooden railing, her voice softening. "You've spent so much of your life playing it safe, Em. Maybe it's time to take a chance. You've earned it." Emma nodded, though the knot in her stomach remained. She couldn't argue with Lily's logic, but the idea of stepping into James Caldwell's world still felt like stepping onto unfamiliar terrain. Beautiful, perhaps, but filled with hidden pitfalls. That evening, as she walked home under a sky painted in shades of pink and orange, Emma decided to clear her head by taking the longer route through the park. The crisp air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves, and the sound of children's laughter echoed from the playground. It was a reminder of the simplicity she had always cherished about Silverbrook, the sense of being rooted in a place where every face was familiar and every street carried memories. But as she turned the corner, her peaceful walk was interrupted by a sight that made her stomach sink. A group of regulars from the diner stood clustered near the gazebo, their voices carrying on the evening breeze. Emma caught snippets of their conversation, her name mentioned more than once. "She's probably looking for a way out," one of the women said, her tone dripping with suspicion. "Can't blame her, really, but it's hard to trust someone who suddenly gets that kind of attention." Another voice chimed in, softer but no less pointed. "Maybe she's just taking advantage of his gratitude. You know how people get around money." Emma froze, their words hitting her like a cold slap. She hadn't realized how deeply the town's gossip had spread, or how much doubt lingered among people she had always considered neighbors, even friends. She turned away quickly, her cheeks burning, and hurried home without looking back. Once inside the safety of her apartment, Emma sat at the kitchen table, the business card in her hand. The weight of other people's opinions pressed heavily on her, but she knew she couldn't make her decision based on their doubts or their whispers. This was her life, her future, and no one else's judgment should dictate her path. Still, the fear of stepping into the unknown was real. James's offer was generous, yes, but it also felt too much like a lifeline tossed into waters she wasn't sure she wanted to swim. Would accepting his help mean losing herself in his world? Or could it be a chance to finally grow beyond the confines of Silverbrook and the expectations that had always tethered her here? The next morning, Emma arrived at the diner to find her usual rhythm disrupted by another surprise. A package sat on the counter, its sleek black wrapping and neatly tied bow standing out starkly against the worn formica. Her boss, Claire, handed it to her with a curious smile. "This came for you early this morning," Claire said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Looks like you've got an admirer." Emma frowned, her name neatly printed on the attached card in a handwriting she recognized immediately, James Caldwell's. She opened the package carefully, revealing a leather-bound notebook with her initials embossed in gold on the cover. Inside, a handwritten note waited on the first page. "Emma, I understand this decision isn't an easy one, and I don't expect an answer overnight. But I hope this small gift reminds you of the endless possibilities ahead. Whatever you choose, know that your courage inspires me. James Caldwell." Emma's breath caught as she read the note. It wasn't grand or ostentatious, but it carried a sincerity that disarmed her. As much as she had resisted his world, James himself seemed different, genuine in a way she hadn't expected. Later that evening, as she sat in her apartment with the notebook open on the table, Emma began to write. The words flowed freely, a mixture of fears, hopes, and questions she hadn't allowed herself to fully acknowledge. By the time she closed the cover, a small but steady resolve had begun to take root within her. Whatever decision she made, it would be hers alone. And for the first time, Emma felt the faint stirrings of belief that maybe, just maybe, she was capable of something greater than the small life she had always known. Emma sat at her kitchen table, the leather-bound notebook open before her, its blank pages calling to her in the stillness of the evening. The soft hum of her refrigerator was the only sound in the small apartment. James Caldwell's note, tucked neatly into the cover, rested against her fingers as she traced its edges absently. It wasn't the gift itself that had unsettled her, but the thoughtfulness behind it. For a man of his means, it would have been simpler to offer something grander, more extravagant, but this felt personal, as though he understood her better than she expected, or perhaps even wanted. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She glanced at the clock. It was late for visitors. Brushing aside her hesitation, Emma stood and opened the door to find her landlord, Mrs. Abernathy, standing there with a weary expression. The elderly woman held a stack of envelopes in her hand. "Evening, dear," Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice kind but tinged with concern. "These came for you earlier. I thought I'd drop them off on my way up." Emma took the letters with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Abernathy. You didn't have to go out of your way." "Nonsense," the older woman said with a wave of her hand. "You're a good tenant, Emma. Always have been." Her gaze lingered on Emma for a moment, her sharp eyes searching. "But you've seemed troubled lately. Is everything all right?" Emma hesitated, clutching the letters to her chest. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." Mrs. Abernathy nodded knowingly. "Well, if you ever need someone to talk to, you know where to find me. Sometimes it helps, sharing the weight." Emma smiled faintly, touched by the gesture. "Thank you. I'll remember that." As the door closed, Emma sat back at the table and flipped through the envelopes. Most were bills, as expected, but one stood out. The return address bore the name of James's foundation. Curious, she opened it to find a formal offer letter detailing the position he had mentioned at their meeting. The terms were generous, far more than she could have imagined, a monthly salary that dwarfed what she earned at the diner, full benefits, and the promise of support for her nursing studies. It was, in every sense, the kind of opportunity she had always dreamed of but never dared to expect. Emma's heart pounded as she read the letter. The practicality of it was undeniable. Accepting the offer would change her life, freeing her from the financial burdens that had defined so much of her existence. But alongside the excitement came the fear, a fear of leaving everything familiar behind, of stepping into a world she didn't understand. The next morning, Emma carried the letter with her to the diner, hoping the familiar routine would help her sort through the storm of emotions swirling within her. The usual crowd of regulars filled the booths, their chatter and laughter a soothing backdrop to her thoughts. But even here, she couldn't escape the whispers. A pair of women at the corner table glanced her way, their voices lowering as she passed. Emma clenched her jaw, determined not to let the gossip get under her skin. "Morning, Emma!" Claire greeted her from behind the counter, her smile as warm as ever. "You doing all right?" Emma nodded, slipping the offer letter into her apron pocket. "Just the usual," she said, though her voice betrayed her unease. Claire gave her a knowing look, her hands deftly arranging pastries on a tray. "You know, sometimes life hands you a chance, and it's scary because it's different, but different doesn't always mean bad." Emma paused, surprised by the comment. "What makes you say that?" Claire shrugged with a faint smile. "I've lived in this town a long time, seen people let fear keep them from growing. You're smart, Emma. Don't let what's comfortable hold you back." The words echoed in Emma's mind throughout her shift, resonating with the advice Lily and Mr. Davenport had given her. But even as she weighed their encouragement, her doubts lingered. What if James's world was too much for her? What if she failed to measure up to his expectations? When her shift ended, Emma found herself walking without purpose, her feet carrying her toward the park. The crisp autumn air was invigorating, and the sound of leaves crunching beneath her boots provided a strange comfort. She found an empty bench and sat down, pulling the offer letter from her pocket. Reading it again, she tried to envision herself in the role James had described, working for a foundation, helping others on a scale she had never imagined. "Still deciding, I see." Emma jumped at the voice, turning to find James Caldwell standing a few feet away, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. He offered her a small, apologetic smile. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you." "It's fine," Emma said, folding the letter and tucking it back into her pocket. "What are you doing here?" "Just passing through," he said, though the timing felt too coincidental to be entirely true. "I thought I might find you here. It seemed like the kind of place you'd go to think." Emma raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I wanted to check in," James said, his tone genuine. "I know this is a big decision, and I don't want you to feel pressured, but I also don't want you to let fear stop you from taking a step forward." Emma met his gaze, surprised by the openness in his expression. "It's not just fear," she admitted. "It's everything. Leaving Silverbrook, stepping into your world. It feels overwhelming." James nodded, his grey eyes thoughtful. "It is overwhelming, but sometimes the best things in life are, you don't have to decide today, Emma. Just know that I believe in you." His words, simple as they were, struck a chord deep within her. As James walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts, Emma realized that for the first time in a long while, she believed in herself too, even if only a little. The decision was made early on a Monday morning, with the first rays of sunlight filtering through Emma's small kitchen window. She had barely slept, the weight of the offer pressing on her through the night. But as she watched the dawn break over Silverbrook, the town she had known all her life, something inside her shifted. Perhaps it was the simplicity of the moment, the reminder that time moved forward regardless of her choices. But Emma finally felt a quiet clarity settle over her. She reached for the phone and dialed the number printed on James Caldwell's card. It rang only twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "This is Elliot Price, Mr. Caldwell's assistant." Emma hesitated, her throat tightening. "Hello, Mr. Price. This is Emma Carter." "Miss Carter," Elliot said, his tone warming slightly. "We've been hoping to hear from you. What can I do for you today?" "I've decided to accept the position," she said, the words spilling out before she could second-guess herself. "I'd like to join Mr. Caldwell's foundation." There was a pause, not of surprise but acknowledgement. as though Elliot had expected this call. "That's excellent news," he said smoothly. "I'll take care of the arrangements immediately. If it's convenient for you, we can send transportation to bring you to the city by the end of the week." Emma blinked, the timeline startling her. "The end of the week? That's soon." "We can adjust, of course," Elliot replied, though his tone suggested efficiency was preferred. "Would you like more time?" "No," Emma said quickly, steeling herself. "The end of the week is fine." After confirming the details, she hung up the phone, her hands trembling slightly. The enormity of what she had agreed to began to sink in. Leaving Silverbrook wasn't just about stepping into a new job, it was stepping into an entirely different life. The days leading up to her departure were filled with a mix of preparation and goodbyes. At the diner, Claire hugged her tightly, her eyes misty. "We're going to miss you around here, Emma," she said, "but I know you're going to do amazing things." Lily was less sentimental, though her excitement was palpable. "You're going to knock their socks off," she declared, grinning as she helped Emma sort through her modest wardrobe. "And don't you dare let anyone in that big city make you feel small. You're every bit as good as they are." Emma smiled at her friend's enthusiasm, though she couldn't shake the nervousness gnawing at her. Silverbrook had been her anchor for so long, and the thought of leaving it behind felt both thrilling and terrifying. The morning of her departure arrived with a sense of finality. A sleek black car waited at the curb, drawing curious looks from neighbors as Emma stepped out of her apartment with a single suitcase in hand. Mrs. Abernathy waved from her porch, her kind smile tinged with pride. "You take care of yourself, Emma," she called, "and don't forget where you came from." Emma nodded, her throat too tight to respond. She climbed into the car, the door closing with a soft thud that seemed to echo in her chest. As the driver pulled away, she watched Silverbrook fade into the distance, the familiar streets and buildings shrinking until they were nothing more than a memory. The city was a stark contrast to the quiet simplicity of her hometown. The skyline loomed ahead, a glittering maze of glass and steel that seemed both beautiful and intimidating. By the time they arrived at the Foundation's headquarters, Emma's nerves were frayed, but she squared her shoulders and stepped out of the car. Elliot Price met her at the entrance, his tailored suit and calm demeanor exuding professionalism. "Welcome, Miss Carter," he said, extending a hand. "It's a pleasure to have you here." Emma shook his hand, grateful for his steady presence. "Thank you. I'm still trying to take it all in. You'll have time to adjust," Elliot assured her. "Let me show you to your office." The Foundation's headquarters was a sleek, modern building filled with bustling energy. Emma passed rows of desks where employees worked intently, their focus unwavering. Elliot led her to a corner office with large windows overlooking the city, a view that took her breath away. "This will be your space," he said, gesturing toward the neatly arranged desk and shelves. "Mr. Caldwell wanted you to have everything you need to feel comfortable." Emma ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the desk, the reality of her new position sinking in. "It's a lot," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Elliot offered a faint smile. "Take your time, Miss Carter. Mr. Caldwell believes in you, and so do we." The day passed in a blur of introductions and orientation meetings. Emma met colleagues who welcomed her warmly, though she couldn't ignore the subtle curiosity in their eyes. She knew she was an anomaly, a small-town girl stepping into a world of polished professionals, but she resolved not to let their scrutiny shake her confidence. Late in the afternoon, James appeared at her office door, his presence filling the room like a quiet storm. "How's your first day going?" he asked, leaning casually against the frame. "It's overwhelming," Emma admitted, though her smile was genuine, but in a good way. James nodded, his grey eyes thoughtful. "It'll get easier. You'll find your rhythm." Emma hesitated, then said, "Thank you for giving me this chance. I still don't know why you chose me, but I'll do my best not to let you down. You don't have to prove anything to me," James said, his voice steady. "Just be yourself, Emma. That's more than enough." As he left, Emma turned back to the view from her window, the city bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel a spark of hope, a belief that perhaps, in this new chapter, she might finally discover the life she had always dreamed of. Emma's first week at the foundation was a whirlwind. Her mornings began earlier than she was used to, the quiet solitude of her small apartment in Silverbrook replaced by the steady hum of the city's streets and the gleaming hallways of her new workplace. The initial shock of it all, the scale, the professionalism, the sharp, polished efficiency of her colleagues made her feel like a fish out of water. But beneath her nervousness, there was a growing determination to prove herself. She found a surprising source of comfort in Henry, James Caldwell's longtime butler. Henry wasn't like anyone Emma had ever met. He was tall and stoic, with an air of quiet authority that was softened by the twinkle in his eye and his occasional wry smile. On her second day, she encountered him in the foundation's staff lounge, where he stood stirring a cup of tea with the precision of a surgeon. "Miss Carter," he greeted her, his voice as smooth as the leather-bound books she imagined lined his shelves at home. "I trust you're settling in," Emma smiled nervously, clutching her coffee mug. It's a lot to take in." Henry studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful, but not unkind. "It always is, at first. Mr. Caldwell has a way of expecting much from those he chooses to bring into his circle, but he also has an uncanny ability to recognize potential." Emma blinked at the remark. "Do you really think I have what it takes to do this?" "Of course," Henry said without hesitation. "He wouldn't have offered you the position otherwise. James Caldwell isn't a man who makes decisions lightly." The conversation lingered in Emma's mind throughout the day. Henry's words carried a weight she couldn't ignore, and his quiet confidence in her abilities offered a small but steadying reassurance. Over the following days, their paths crossed often, and a natural camaraderie developed between them. Henry's dry humor and sharp insights reminded Emma of the stories her mother used to tell about her own father, who had possessed a similar quiet strength. One afternoon, during a rare lull in her schedule, Emma found herself sitting with Henry in the lounge again. He was organizing a stack of papers while she nursed a cup of tea, their conversation drifting toward James. "You've worked for Mr. Caldwell a long time, haven't you?" Emma asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Nearly 2 decades, Henry replied. "I've seen him at his best and his worst." Emma hesitated before asking, "What's he really like? Beyond the businessman, I mean." Henry set down the papers, his expression softening. "James is complicated. He has a brilliant mind, but it's a restless one. He's driven, often to his own detriment, and he carries burdens he rarely speaks of." Emma tilted her head, intrigued. What kind of burdens? Henry's lips pressed into a thin line, as if considering how much to reveal. "Losing his wife changed him," he said at last. "It was years ago, a car accident that left him grieving and guilt-ridden. Since then, he's poured himself into his work, trying to build something meaningful, perhaps as a way to atone for what he couldn't control." Emma felt a pang of empathy, her mind flashing to memories of her own losses. She hadn't known this side of James Caldwell, the man who carried pain beneath his polished exterior. It explained the flickers of vulnerability she had glimpsed in him, moments that had made her wonder if there was more to him than his wealth and power. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked softly. Henry met her gaze, his expression unreadable, because you might be the first person in a long time who has the capacity to see him for who he truly is, rather than what he represents. The words stayed with Emma as she returned to her work. She found herself looking at James differently during their interactions, noticing the way his eyes lingered on the photographs lining the walls of the Foundation's offices. Images of children smiling in newly built schools, families in the warmth of a rebuilt home. There was a sincerity in his dedication that she hadn't fully appreciated before. But Emma's adjustment wasn't without its challenges. Not everyone welcomed her presence with open arms. Victoria Caldwell, James's estranged sister, made her feelings clear during their first encounter at a board meeting. "And who is this?" Victoria had asked, her sharp gaze sweeping over Emma with an air of practiced indifference. "The new project manager? Or is James dabbling in philanthropy by hiring charity cases now?" The words stung, but Emma forced herself to remain composed. "Emma Carter," she said, extending a hand. "I'm honored to be part of the team." Victoria ignored the gesture, her smile icy. "I'm sure you are." James intervened quickly, redirecting the conversation to the agenda at hand, but the tension between him and his sister was palpable. Later, Emma overheard snippets of their argument in his office, Victoria's voice rising in frustration. "You're using her," Victoria accused. "And for what? To distract yourself from the mess you've made of everything else." "She's here because she deserves to be," James replied, his tone sharp. "And what I do with my foundation is none of your concern." The exchange left Emma feeling uneasy, though it also deepened her resolve. Whatever doubts Victoria or others might have about her place at the foundation, Emma was determined to prove them wrong. As the day ended, Emma found herself alone in her office, the city lights twinkling outside her window. She thought of Henry's words, of the burdens James carried and the barriers she was slowly breaking through in herself. She didn't know where this journey would lead, but for the first time, she felt certain it was one worth taking. Emma's second month at the foundation began with a sense of cautious optimism. She had settled into her role more comfortably than she anticipated, finding satisfaction in the work she did. Coordinating projects that provided medical supplies to underfunded clinics and scholarships for aspiring nurses felt deeply personal. For the first time in her life, Emma felt her work aligned with the dreams she had carried since she was a teenager tending to her mother. But beneath the surface, trouble was brewing. The foundation, with its sprawling influence and generous initiatives, had become a target for those who envied or resented James Caldwell's success. It started subtly. Questions from the press about the foundation's funding sources, whispers in meetings about leaked documents. Emma didn't think much of it at first, but by the time it reached her desk, it became impossible to ignore. She found the file in her inbox late one Friday afternoon, a thin manila folder with her name written across the tab. Inside were copies of news articles, anonymous letters, and even a few emails that seemed to cast doubt on her past. Her family's financial struggles, her mother's unpaid medical bills, and even her modest education were laid out like evidence in a trial. Emma stared at the documents, her hands trembling. It was as though someone had plundered the most vulnerable corners of her life and laid them bare. Her door creaked open, and Henry stepped inside, his usual air of calm giving way to a faint crease of concern on his brow. "You've seen it then," he said without preamble. Emma held up the file, her voice shaking. "What is this, Henry? Why is my personal life being dragged into this?" Henry closed the door behind him and took a seat across from her. "It's a tactic," he said simply. "James has enemies in the business world, people who would rather see his foundation fail than succeed. They're trying to discredit him, and unfortunately, you've become an easy target." "That doesn't make sense," Emma said, her voice rising. "I've done nothing wrong. My past has nothing to do with the foundation." "It doesn't have to," Henry replied, his tone measured. "They're using it to sow doubt, to make it seem as though James's judgment is flawed. By hiring you, someone they claim is unqualified, they hope to tarnish his reputation." Emma leaned back in her chair, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. "So what do I do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stay the course," Henry said firmly. "You've done nothing wrong, Emma. Let your work speak for itself. And trust James to handle the rest." Henry's words were reassuring, but the knot in Emma's stomach refused to loosen. That evening, she found herself walking the city streets, seeking solace in the anonymity of the bustling crowds. The noise and lights offered a strange comfort, but her thoughts remained heavy. She wasn't surprised when James called her later that night. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of frustration beneath it. "Emma, I'm sorry this has happened," he said. "I never intended for you to be caught in the crossfire." "It's not your fault," Emma replied, though she didn't entirely believe it. "But it feels personal, like someone's trying to tear me apart." "They are," James said bluntly, "because they see you as a way to get to me, but I won't let them succeed." There was a pause, and when James spoke again, his tone softened. "You're stronger than you think, Emma. I've seen it. Don't let them intimidate you." The call ended, but James's words lingered. Emma spent the weekend trying to push aside her fears, focusing instead on the projects she had lined up for the coming week. But when Monday arrived, the tension in the office was palpable. Victoria Caldwell's arrival only added to the unease. She swept into the boardroom with an air of authority, her sharp eyes scanning the room before settling on Emma. "So," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "the charity case is still here." Emma's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Good morning, Miss Caldwell," she said, her tone even. Victoria smirked. "It's bold of you to show your face after the headlines this weekend, but I suppose you're used to hardship." Before Emma could respond, James entered the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. He ignored Victoria's barbed comment, instead directing the meeting with his usual efficiency. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling of being under a microscope, Victoria's cold gaze following her every move. After the meeting, Emma retreated to her office, her nerves frayed. She was scrolling through her email when an anonymous message caught her eye. The subject line read, "Know who your real friends are." Against her better judgment, she opened it. The email contained a single line, "Not everyone in the foundation has your back." Emma's heart sank as she stared at the screen. The warning felt like a seed of doubt taking root in her mind. Who could she trust? The foundation was filled with accomplished professionals, but the recent attacks had made her question everything. That evening, Emma confided in Lily over the phone. "I feel like I'm drowning," she admitted, her voice cracking. "Everywhere I turn, there's someone waiting for me to fail." "You listen to me," Lily said fiercely. "You are not going to let these people get to you. You're there for a reason, Emma. They're scared of you because they know you belong." Emma clung to her friend's words, finding strength in them. As the week wore on, she resolved to push forward, even as the whispers and stares continued. She threw herself into her work, determined to prove her worth, not just to the foundation, but to herself. By the end of the week, Emma had completed a proposal for a new project, one that would expand the foundation's reach to rural clinics across the country. When she presented it to James, his approval was immediate and genuine. "This is excellent work, Emma," he said, his grey eyes steady. "You're exactly where you're meant to be." For the first time in days, Emma allowed herself a small smile. The challenges weren't over, but she was beginning to see that her place in the foundation, and in James's world, wasn't as precarious as she had feared. Emma's proposal for the rural clinic project had marked a turning point in her confidence, but the challenges surrounding her position at the foundation were far from over. As the weeks unfolded, Emma began to notice strange patterns, documents misplaced, schedules altered without her knowledge, and moments where she felt the subtle tension of being watched. It wasn't overt, but it was enough to unsettle her, particularly given the anonymous warning she had received. One afternoon, as she sorted through project files in her office, a knock at the door startled her. She looked up to find Henry standing in the doorway, a rare shadow of concern crossing his usually composed face. "Miss Carter," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "I've come across something that I believe you need to see." He handed her a folder, the contents as meticulous as everything Henry seemed to handle. Inside were several pages detailing internal emails, reports, and memos that suggested deliberate sabotage within the foundation. Emma's name appeared repeatedly, linked to discrepancies that she knew she had no hand in creating. Her stomach tightened as she read, "What is this, Henry? Are they trying to frame me?" "It appears so," Henry said gravely. "Someone within the organization is working to undermine you and, by extension, James." Emma's mind raced. The whispers, the misplaced files, even Victoria's cold hostility, it all began to make sense. But the idea that someone was actively plotting against her felt both infuriating and deeply unfair. "Do you know who's behind this?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Henry hesitated, his gaze steady. "I have my suspicions, but I won't act without evidence. What I do know is that this isn't just about you. It's part of a larger scheme to destabilize the foundation." Emma closed the folder, her heart pounding. "What should I do?" "For now, remain vigilant," Henry advised. "And whatever you do, don't let them see that you're aware. If we can gather enough evidence, we can expose them." Emma nodded, though the thought of continuing under such scrutiny made her uneasy. Henry's confidence in her was reassuring, but it didn't erase the knot of doubt twisting in her chest. That evening, Emma stayed late at the office, poring over project details and cross-referencing documents to ensure her work was airtight. The city lights twinkled outside her window, a stark contrast to the growing shadows of suspicion within the foundation. As the hours ticked by, she heard footsteps in the hallway and glanced up to see James standing in her doorway. "You're still here?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Emma offered a tired smile. "Just trying to stay ahead of everything." James stepped into the room, his grey eyes narrowing as he studied her. "You've been under a lot of pressure lately, more than you should be." "I'm managing," Emma said, though the weariness in her tone betrayed her. James crossed his arms, leaning against the edge of her desk. "Emma, if something's going on, you need to tell me. I can't help if I don't know." For a moment, she considered confiding in him, but Henry's warning to remain discreet echoed in her mind. Instead, she shook her head. "It's nothing I can't handle." James didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. "Just remember," he said, his voice softening, "you're not alone in this. I've been where you are, feeling like the walls are closing in. But you're stronger than you think." Emma nodded, grateful for his support, even as she kept the full truth from him. After James left, she sat back in her chair, her thoughts spinning. The weight of the situation was growing heavier, but she refused to let it break her. The next morning, Emma received a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was low and distorted, clearly altered to conceal the speaker's identity. "You're getting too close to something you don't understand," the voice warned. "If you know what's good for you, you'll walk away." Emma's blood ran cold. The call was brief, the line going dead before she could respond. She stared at the phone in her hand, her heart racing, Whoever was behind the sabotage wasn't content to work in the shadows. They wanted her to know she was a target. But instead of scaring her into submission, the call only strengthened Emma's resolve. She returned to the office that day with a newfound determination, her focus sharper than ever. If someone thought they could intimidate her into leaving, they didn't know her well enough. By the end of the week, Emma had quietly begun her own investigation, carefully documenting every irregularity she encountered. She enlisted Henry's help, their collaboration growing into a partnership built on mutual trust. Together, they began to piece together a trail of clues that pointed to a source closer than Emma had anticipated. One evening, while reviewing files in her office, she stumbled upon a memo that made her stomach drop. It was a communication between Alan Turner, one of James's most trusted business partners, and an external consultant. The language was vague but suggested financial dealings that contradicted the Foundation's stated goals. Emma's heart pounded as she realized the implications. Alan wasn't just undermining her, he was betraying James. She called Henry immediately, her voice shaking as she explained what she had found. "We need to tell James," she said, the urgency clear in her tone. "Not yet," Henry cautioned. "If we act too soon, we risk tipping our hand. Let me look into this further. We need undeniable proof." Emma agreed, though the weight of the discovery pressed heavily on her. She couldn't fathom how someone so close to James could be capable of such treachery. But one thing was clear. The fight she had stumbled into was far larger than she had imagined. As the city settled into the quiet of night, Emma sat alone in her office. The lights dimmed and her mind racing. The challenges ahead felt insurmountable, but a spark of determination burned within her. She had come too far to back down now. Emma's discovery about Alan Turner hung over her like a storm cloud. The realization that someone so trusted within James's inner circle could be working against him was both shocking and deeply unsettling. She spent the following days moving cautiously, her interactions with Alan polite but guarded, while she and Henry quietly dug deeper into his activities. Henry, as always, proved to be a steady ally. He moved with a discretion born of years of loyal service, slipping into offices after hours to retrieve files and following trails others might have overlooked. Meanwhile, Emma focused on assembling the pieces of the puzzle, cross-referencing documents and emails that painted a clearer picture of Alan's betrayal. It wasn't just personal. His actions jeopardized the Foundation's integrity and threatened to undo the good it had accomplished. One evening, as Emma sifted through yet another stack of reports, she found herself reflecting on the path that had brought her here. It seemed impossible that only months ago she had been a waitress in Silverbrook, worried about paying bills and finishing her nursing classes. Now, she was entangled in a conflict that felt larger than life, one that tested her courage and resolve at every turn. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was a text from Henry, meeting room 4A, 10 minutes. Emma felt a pang of apprehension, but quickly gathered her notes and made her way to the designated room. Henry was already there, his expression unusually grave. "What is it?" Emma asked, closing the door behind her. Henry slid a file across the table. "I believe we have what we need. These documents tie Alan directly to questionable financial dealings involving the Foundation's funds. He's been diverting money into a private account under the guise of consulting fees." Emma scanned the papers, her heart sinking. The evidence was damning, but it also meant they would have to confront Alan and, eventually, James. She looked up at Henry, her voice quiet but firm. "We have to tell James." Henry nodded. "I agree, but this won't be easy for him. Alan has been by his side for years, through some of the most difficult times in his life. This betrayal will cut deep." Emma swallowed hard. her resolve solidifying. Then we have to make sure we handle this carefully. James deserves the truth, but he also needs to know we're in his corner. The opportunity came sooner than Emma expected. The next morning, James called a staff meeting to discuss the foundation's upcoming initiatives. The atmosphere in the boardroom was tense, though James himself seemed unaware of the undercurrents. Alan sat across the table from Emma, his demeanor as confident as ever, a faint smile playing on his lips as though he were untouchable. As the meeting progressed, Emma exchanged a glance with Henry, who gave her a barely perceptible nod. When the discussion turned to the foundation's financial health, Emma seized her chance. "James," she began, her voice steady despite the anxiety coiling in her chest, "there's something that needs to be addressed." "It's about the foundation's accounts," James frowned, his sharp eyes narrowing. "What about them?" Emma hesitated, then pressed on. "Henry and I have uncovered evidence that suggests funds are being misused, specifically by someone in a senior position." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Emma. Alan's smile faltered, a flicker of unease crossing his face. James leaned forward, his tone measured but firm. "Who?" Emma drew a deep breath, her gaze unwavering. "Alan Turner!" A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a tense silence. Alan recovered quickly, his expression hardening. "This is a serious accusation," he said, his voice cold. "I hope you have evidence to back it up." "We do," Henry interjected, placing the file on the table. "These documents detail the transactions in question. The funds were funneled through a private account linked to you under false pretenses." James opened the file, his jaw tightening as he read. The tension in the room was palpable, the weight of the revelation pressing down on everyone present. Alan's composure began to crack. "This is a misunderstanding," he said quickly. "Those funds were for legitimate expenses, consulting fees, as Emma said. I can explain." "Enough," James said, his voice sharp. He closed the file, his grey eyes locking onto Alan. "I trusted you, Alan, for years. I trusted you, and this is how you repay me." Alan faltered, the bravado draining from his expression. "James, listen to me." "No," James interrupted, his tone icy. "I've heard enough." The meeting ended abruptly, with James dismissing the staff and ordering security to escort Alan out of the building. Emma stayed behind, her heart heavy as she watched James stand by the window, his shoulders tense. "James," she said softly, stepping closer. "I'm sorry." He didn't turn, but his voice carried the weight of his pain. "Don't be. You did the right thing. It's just hard to accept that someone I considered a friend could betray me like this." Emma hesitated, then placed a hand on his arm. "You're not alone in this. We'll get through it." James finally looked at her, his expression a mix of gratitude and weariness. "Thank you, Emma, for everything." As Emma left the office that evening, she felt both relief and exhaustion. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt a sense of victory, not just for herself, but for the foundation and everything it stood for. The road ahead would be difficult, but Emma was ready to face whatever came next, with James and Henry by her side. The aftermath of Alan Turner's exposure rippled through the foundation like a cold wind. His sudden departure left a void, but it also unearthed questions and uncertainties that couldn't be ignored. For days, James worked tirelessly with his legal team to assess the damage, poring over financial reports and addressing the fallout with donors and partners. The strain was evident in the tight lines around his eyes and the clipped tone of his voice during meetings. Emma, meanwhile, found herself navigating a storm of emotions. There was relief in knowing the truth had come to light, but also a lingering unease. Alan's betrayal wasn't just a professional matter, it was personal for James, and the weight of that betrayal bore heavily on him. Emma wanted to help, but she also felt the limits of her place in his world. One late evening, as she was finishing up in her office, Henry appeared in the doorway, his expression thoughtful. "You've done well, Miss Carter," he said, stepping inside. "Not many would have had the courage to bring this to light." Emma looked up from her notes, offering a faint smile. "I didn't do it alone. You and James, you've both carried the burden more than I have." Henry shook his head. "Don't downplay your role. It was your persistence, your refusal to back down, that made all the difference." Emma set her pen down, her gaze drifting to the city lights outside the window. "Do you think he'll be all right, James? I mean..." Henry's expression softened. "James has been through worse, but this will leave a scar. Alan wasn't just a colleague. He was someone James trusted implicitly. Losing that kind of trust, it changes a person." Emma nodded, her chest tightening at the thought. She had seen glimpses of James's vulnerability over the past weeks, moments when the weight of his responsibilities seemed almost too much to bear. He had a way of masking his pain with strength, but she sensed the cracks beneath the surface. The following day, James called a staff meeting to address the team. His presence, as always, commanded attention. But there was a somberness in his tone as he spoke. "I want to thank all of you for your dedication and hard work during this difficult time," he began, his grey eyes sweeping the room. "The Foundation has faced challenges before, but this was a betrayal I didn't see coming. And I want to be clear. Our work will continue. We won't let this derail the mission we've built together." Emma felt a swell of admiration for him as he spoke, his determination shining through despite the turmoil. When the meeting ended, she lingered in the boardroom, gathering her notes. James approached her, his expression weary but sincere. "Emma," he said, his voice quieter now that the room had emptied. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course," she replied, setting her notes aside. James hesitated, running a hand through his dark hair. "I owe you an apology. I put you in a position you shouldn't have had to face. Alan's actions, they weren't your burden to carry." Emma shook her head, meeting his gaze. "You don't have to apologize, James. I wanted to help, and I'm glad I could." His expression softened, a hint of gratitude in his eyes. "You've done more than help, Emma. You've reminded me what this foundation is supposed to be about. It's easy to lose sight of that when you're surrounded by people like Alan." The weight of his words hung between them, unspoken but understood. Emma reached out, her hand brushing his arm in a gesture of quiet support. "You haven't lost sight of it, James. That's why this place exists. That's why all of us are here." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you," he said simply. As the days turned into weeks, the foundation began to find its footing again. Emma threw herself into her work, collaborating with Henry and the rest of the team to implement the rural clinic project. The initiative gained traction quickly, earning praise from donors and communities alike. For the first time since she had arrived, Emma felt a sense of accomplishment that was hers alone, a quiet validation that she belonged. But even as the foundation moved forward, shadows lingered. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Alan's betrayal was part of something larger, something not yet fully revealed. She found herself revisiting old reports, searching for patterns or clues that might hint at other hidden dangers. It was during one of these late-night sessions that she stumbled across an email chain that raised her suspicions. The language was cryptic, but it suggested that Alan hadn't acted alone. The realization sent a chill down her spine. If Alan had accomplices, it meant the Foundation and James were still at risk. She debated whether to bring it to Henry or James, but caution held her back. Without concrete proof, she feared creating more tension in an already strained environment. Instead, she confided in Lily during one of their late-night phone calls. "I can't shake the feeling that there's more to this," Emma admitted, pacing her small apartment. "It's like peeling back layers of an onion. Every time I think I've gotten to the core, there's something else." Lily's voice was firm. "Then keep digging, Em. If anyone can figure this out, it's you. Just be careful. People like Alan don't go down without a fight." Emma nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she was determined to follow it, no matter how dark it became. For James, for the foundation, and for herself, she had to see it through. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the foundation's headquarters, casting long streaks of light across the polished floors. Emma walked briskly to her office, her mind racing with thoughts of the cryptic emails she had uncovered. She felt the weight of their implications, as though they were a heavy stone in her pocket, one she was unsure how to lay down. The air in the building seemed heavier than usual, the aftershocks of Alan's betrayal still rippling through the organization. Though most of the team had rallied under James's steady leadership, a faint unease lingered in the corridors, an unspoken fear that more secrets might yet surface. Emma set her bag on her desk and reached for the files she'd been working on the night before. The emails were at the top of the stack, their vague references to secured interests and off-the-record consultations raising more questions than they answered. She had cross-referenced the sender's address with internal directories, but the trail ended at an unfamiliar name, Rachel Harrington, listed as a consultant for a brief period during the prior year. "Morning," Henry's voice interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see him standing in her doorway, his expression neutral but observant. "You look like you've been burning the midnight oil." Emma gave a small smile, gesturing to the pile of papers. "I think I found something, but it's incomplete. There's a name, Rachel Harrington, and some vague references that suggest Alan might not have been working alone." Henry's brow furrowed as he stepped into the office and picked up the top sheet. "This complicates things," he said after a moment. "If Alan had support, it's possible the sabotage runs deeper than we thought." Emma nodded, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the desk. "I want to bring this to James, but I don't want to alarm him without more proof. What do you think?" Henry considered her question carefully, his steady presence a comfort. "James deserves to know, but you're right to tread carefully. If there's more at play here, we need to ensure we've got all the pieces before taking action." Emma sighed, the weight of her responsibility pressing down on her. "I'll keep digging," she said. "There has to be more to find." Henry gave her a reassuring nod. "You're on the right track, Emma. And remember, you're not in this alone." As the day wore on, Emma's search took her deeper into the Foundation's archives. She pored over contracts, financial reports, and personnel files, chasing any lead that might connect Rachel Harrington to Alan's schemes. Hours passed, the hum of activity around her fading as she lost herself in the work. It was late in the afternoon when she found what she had been looking for. A single memo, buried in a folder of unrelated documents, bore Rachel's signature alongside a set of initials, A.T. Alan Turner. The memo outlined a strategic initiative that involved reallocating foundation funds to a third-party account. The language was vague enough to obscure its true intent, but the implications were clear to Emma. Her heart raced as she copied the document and tucked the original back into the file. This was the proof she needed to show James that Alan hadn't acted alone. But as she prepared to leave her office, her phone buzzed on the desk, the screen lighting up with an unfamiliar number. Cautiously, she answered, "Hello, Miss Carter." A smooth, unfamiliar voice said, "You've been busy." Emma's breath caught, her grip tightening on the phone. Who is this? Someone who knows when to stay out of other people's business, the voice replied, a subtle menace in their tone. I suggest you do the same. It's for your own good. The line went dead before Emma could respond, leaving her staring at the phone in disbelief. The warning, though vague, was enough to send a chill down her spine. Whoever was behind the sabotage knew she was closing in, and they weren't afraid to make their presence known. That evening, Emma sat in her apartment, the memo spread out on the table before her. The weight of her discovery, combined with the anonymous threat, made sleep impossible. She called Lily, her voice trembling as she recounted the day's events. This is serious, Em, Lily said, her tone sharp with concern. You need to tell James. Now. I know, Emma replied, her throat tightening. But what if this just makes things worse? What if? No what ifs, Lily interrupted firmly. You've worked too hard to back down now. James needs to know the truth, no matter how messy it gets. Emma nodded, though Lily couldn't see her. You're right. I'll tell him tomorrow. The next morning, Emma arrived at the office with renewed determination. She carried the memo and her notes with her, ready to face whatever fallout might come. James was in his office when she knocked, his expression softening when he saw her. Emma, he said, gesturing for her to come in. What's on your mind? She closed the door behind her and placed the memo on his desk. I found this, she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. It's from Rachel Harrington. It links her to Alan and suggests they were working together to divert funds. James picked up the memo, his brow furrowing as he read. This is damning, he said after a moment, his voice low, and you're certain there's no mistake. I've double-checked everything, Emma said firmly. There's more, James. I received a call yesterday, a threat, telling me to stop looking into this. James's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening with anger. This isn't just about the foundation anymore, he said. It's about protecting the people who believe in it, including you. For the first time, Emma saw a vulnerability in James that mirrored her own, a mix of fear and determination that came from knowing the stakes had never been higher. Together, they would face whatever came next, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was only beginning. The morning after Emma handed James the memo was quiet, but there was a tension in the air that seemed to vibrate through the foundation's halls. James had called an emergency meeting with his legal and operations teams, leaving Emma to wait in her office, her thoughts a tangle of worry and resolve. She couldn't help but replay the ominous phone call in her mind, the voice's chilling warning echoing in her ears. Whoever was behind the sabotage clearly didn't intend to go down without a fight. By midday, James called her into his office. The blinds were drawn, casting the room in muted light, and James's expression was one of grim determination. Henry stood near the door, his usual calm replaced with an air of quiet vigilance. Emma, James began, gesturing for her to sit. I've shared the memo with our legal team. They're investigating Rachel Harrington's connections to Alan and anyone else who might be involved. This is bigger than I anticipated, and I want you to know how much I appreciate what you've done. Emma nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I just want to make sure the foundation is protected and that the people we're trying to help don't suffer because of this. James's expression softened slightly, though the weight of his responsibility was evident in the set of his jaw. We'll get through this, he said firmly, but there's something else. I've received word that Rachel was seen meeting with a potential whistleblower. If she's turning to the press, this could escalate quickly. The thought sent a chill through Emma. What should we do? For now, we wait, James said. Our team is tracking her movements, and we're preparing a public statement if necessary. But I need you to be careful, Emma. Whoever's behind this won't hesitate to target you again. Henry stepped forward, his voice steady but laced with concern. "We're taking precautions, but you need to stay alert. If anything feels off, don't hesitate to reach out." Emma nodded, grateful for their support, though the weight of their warnings settled heavily on her shoulders. As she left James's office, she felt the pressure of the situation closing in around her. This wasn't just about protecting the foundation, it was about protecting herself and the people she had come to care about. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and emails, but Emma's mind was elsewhere. That evening, as she returned to her apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The city's usual bustle seemed quieter, the shadows stretching longer than usual. She quickened her pace, relief washing over her as she locked the door behind her. Her phone buzzed on the counter, the screen lighting up with a text from Lily. "Just checking in. How are you holding up?" Emma typed a quick response, grateful for her friend's unwavering support. "It's a lot, but I'm okay. Thanks for checking on me." Lily's reply came almost immediately. "You're stronger than you think. Em, don't forget that." Emma smiled faintly, her spirits lifting ever so slightly. She made herself a cup of tea and settled on the couch, determined to relax, if only for a little while. But as she sipped her tea, her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from an unknown number. Her stomach tightened as she answered. "Hello?" There was a pause, then a familiar voice. "Miss Carter, I see you didn't heed my warning." Emma's heart raced. "Who is this? What do you want?" "What I want," the voice replied coolly, "is for you to stay out of matters that don't concern you. Walk away while you still can." The line went dead before Emma could respond, leaving her shaken and angry. She clutched the phone tightly, her fear giving way to a surge of defiance. Whoever this person was, they underestimated her. She wasn't about to back down. Not now, not ever. The following morning, Emma shared the call with James and Henry. James's expression darkened as he listened, his fists clenching at his sides. "This has gone too far," he said, his voice low but firm. "We need to expose whoever's behind this before they can do more damage." Henry nodded, his tone grave. "Agreed, but we'll need to move carefully. If they're willing to make threats, they're likely to escalate if cornered." Emma watched the exchange, her resolve hardening. "I'll do whatever it takes to help," she said. "But I'm not going to live in fear of them." James met her gaze, his expression softening slightly. "I admire your courage, Emma, but I won't let you face this alone. We'll get through this, together." As the day unfolded, the Foundation's team worked tirelessly to piece together the web of connections between Rachel, Alan, and their potential accomplices. Emma spent hours combing through files, her determination unyielding despite the weight of the threats hanging over her. By evening, there was a breakthrough. One of the legal team members uncovered a bank statement that linked Rachel to an offshore account tied to a known corporate rival of James's, a man named Victor Graham. The revelation sent shockwaves through the team, confirming their suspicions that the sabotage was part of a larger scheme to undermine the Foundation. Emma's pulse quickened as she shared the news with James. "This proves it," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her. "They've been working together to take you down." James nodded, his expression a mix of relief and determination. "It's time to take this public," he said. "We need to show the world what's been happening and make it clear that we won't be silenced." As Emma left the office that night, the weight of the day's events settled over her like a heavy cloak. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a spark of hope. Together, they were uncovering the truth, and with it, the strength to fight for what was right. The next morning, the Foundation's offices were abuzz with activity. The legal team worked tirelessly to prepare the evidence for a formal release, while James held back-to-back meetings with key staff members, ensuring that every detail was accounted for. Emma watched the flurry of activity from her desk, her heart both heavy with the gravity of the situation and lightened by the progress they were making. Henry appeared at her door, a quiet but steady presence as always. "Emma," he said, stepping inside, "James is holding a meeting in 20 minutes. He wants you there." Emma nodded, setting aside the stack of documents she'd been reviewing. "I'll be ready." Henry lingered for a moment, his expression uncharacteristically somber. "You've done more for this foundation than anyone could have expected," he said quietly. "James sees it, and so do I. Whatever happens next, you've already proven your worth." Emma's throat tightened at his words, and she managed a small smile. "Thank you, Henry. That means a lot." The meeting was held in the largest conference room, the long table filled with senior staff and key advisors. James stood at the head, his commanding presence drawing the room's attention as soon as he began to speak. "We've uncovered clear evidence that Rachel Harrington and Alan Turner were working in concert with support from Victor Graham," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Their goal was to undermine the foundation, discredit its leadership, and divert funds for their own purposes." A murmur ran through the room, but James raised a hand, silencing it. "We will not let this deter us. The foundation's mission is too important. I've instructed our legal team to move forward with the necessary actions, and we'll be releasing a public statement by the end of the day." Emma watched as James's words settled over the room, their weight undeniable. For all the challenges he had faced, his resolve was unshaken, and she felt a renewed sense of admiration for his leadership. As the meeting concluded, James motioned for Emma to stay behind. When the room emptied, he turned to her, his expression softer now that they were alone. "You've been at the center of this from the start," he said. "I know it hasn't been easy, but I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done." Emma hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I just did what I thought was right," she said finally. James smiled faintly. "That's what makes you different, Emma. Most people would have walked away, but you stayed. You've shown more courage and integrity than I've seen in years." His words warmed her, but they also deepened her sense of responsibility. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," James said, his gaze steady, "we face whatever comes next, together." The afternoon passed in a blur of preparations. By the time the statement was released to the media, the Foundation's offices were quiet, the day's work giving way to a tense anticipation of what the response would bring. Emma returned to her desk, exhausted but unwilling to leave until she was sure there were no loose ends. As she packed up her things, her phone buzzed with a message from Lily. "Saw the news. Proud of you, Em. Stay strong." Emma smiled, her heart lifting at her friend's encouragement. She replied quickly, "Thanks, Lily. I'll call you later." But before she could put her phone away, it buzzed again, this time with a call from an unknown number. Her stomach clenched as she hesitated, then answered, "Hello." "Miss Carter," the familiar, cold voice said. "You've been busy." Emma's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't know who you are, but this needs to stop." "Oh, I don't think so," the voice replied, a faint hint of amusement in their tone. "You've made a lot of noise, and people like me don't appreciate noise." "People like you?" Emma shot back, anger flaring. "You mean cowards who hide behind threats?" There was a pause, then a chuckle. "You're brave, I'll give you that, but bravery won't protect you, Miss Carter. Walk away before it's too late." The line went dead, leaving Emma gripping the phone tightly, her anger and fear warring within her. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Whoever this person was, they wouldn't scare her into silence. She had come too far to back down now. The next morning, Emma arrived at the office to find James and Henry waiting for her in the lobby. Their expressions were serious, but there was an undercurrent of determination in their demeanor. "We've traced the call," James said without preamble. "It was made from a disposable phone linked to Victor Graham's company." Emma's heart pounded. "So it's him." "It's him," Henry confirmed. "And we're not letting him get away with it." James placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze steady. "Emma, you've been instrumental in uncovering this. I won't let you face any more of it alone. We're taking this to the authorities." Emma nodded, her resolve solidifying. Together they would see this through, no matter the cost. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation and a sense of gravity that seemed to silence even the faintest whispers. Emma sat near the front, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she watched the proceedings unfold. James was seated beside her, his usual commanding presence tempered by a quiet determination. To his right, his legal team conferred in low tones, their focus unwavering. The trial against Victor Graham and Rachel Harrington had captured the attention of the media, their scheme to sabotage the foundation laid bare for all to see. The evidence Emma had helped uncover had been pivotal, and now, after weeks of preparation, the truth was being brought to light. "Miss Carter," the attorney called, signaling it was her turn to testify. Emma rose, her step steady despite the nerves that coursed through her. As she took the stand, she glanced at James, who gave her a faint nod of encouragement. She drew a deep breath, her resolve firming. The questions came swiftly, each one designed to establish the depth of the conspiracy she had uncovered. Emma spoke clearly, recounting the series of events that had led her to uncover Alan Turner's betrayal and Rachel's involvement. She described the threatening phone calls, the falsified documents, and the meticulous effort it had taken to piece everything together. "Did you ever consider walking away?" the defense attorney asked, his tone probing. Emma hesitated, her mind flashing back to the moments of fear and doubt she had faced, but then she straightened, her voice steady as she replied, "Yes, I considered it, but I knew what was at stake. The Foundation's mission was too important to abandon, no matter how difficult it got." The attorney nodded, seemingly satisfied, and moved on to other lines of questioning. Emma's testimony lasted nearly an hour, but to her it felt both longer and shorter, a blur of words and memories that left her drained but resolute. When she stepped down from the stand, James met her at the bench, his expression filled with quiet pride. "You did well," he said, his voice low. "Better than well." Emma managed a small smile, though her heart still raced. "I just told the truth. And that's enough," James replied, his hand briefly brushing her shoulder in a gesture of reassurance. The trial continued for several more hours, each witness adding another layer to the web of deceit that Victor and Rachel had woven. By the time the closing arguments were made, it was clear that the evidence was overwhelming. Still, the waiting was agonizing. The jury's deliberations stretched into the evening, and Emma found herself pacing the courthouse corridors, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. James joined her after a while, his calm presence a steadying force. "You've done everything you could," he said. "Now we let the system do its job." "I know," Emma replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's hard not to worry." James nodded, his gaze distant for a moment. "It is. But no matter what happens, you've shown more courage than anyone could ask for. That won't be forgotten." Hours later, the jury returned, their verdict swift and decisive, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the judge delivered the sentences. Victor Graham would face years in prison, and Rachel Harrington was given a substantial fine and barred from any future roles in non-profit work. As the gavel fell, a wave of relief washed over Emma. The fight was over, and justice had been served. She turned to James, who was watching the proceedings with a mix of satisfaction and quiet contemplation. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," James corrected, his gaze meeting hers. "This was never just about me. The media swarmed outside the courthouse, their questions flying fast and furious as Emma and James stepped into the cool evening air. James handled the reporters with his usual poise, delivering a brief statement that emphasized the Foundation's commitment to transparency and integrity. Emma stayed in the background, content to let James take the lead. But as the reporters dispersed, he turned to her, a faint smile on his lips. "You should be proud of yourself," he said. "None of this would have been possible without you." "I couldn't have done it alone," Emma replied. "And I wouldn't have wanted to." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes it takes a team, and sometimes it takes someone with the courage to stand up for what's right. You've been both." As they returned to the Foundation's headquarters, Emma felt a sense of closure settling over her. The challenges they had faced had been immense, but they had come through them stronger and with their mission intact. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, the weight of the ordeal lifting from her shoulders. That night, as she sat by her window, the city lights twinkling below, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had entered this world as a stranger, uncertain of her place. But now she knew she belonged, not because of what she had accomplished, but because of the values she had upheld. Her phone buzzed with a message from Lily. "You're amazing, Em. Never forget that." Emma smiled, her heart full. For all the trials she had endured, she had found a strength she hadn't known she possessed, and a sense of purpose that would guide her forward, no matter what lay ahead. The weeks following the trial were filled with a mixture of relief and reflection. For the first time in what felt like ages, the Foundation was able to turn its attention back to the work that mattered most, the projects and communities it supported. Emma watched as the team, once strained by the turmoil, began to operate with a renewed sense of purpose. Yet amid the progress, Emma found herself drawn to a quieter pursuit. One afternoon, as she organized a stack of files in her office, her eyes lingered on a folder labeled Silverbrook. It was a set of proposals she had worked on early in her time at the Foundation, detailing plans for a rural clinic in her hometown. At the time, it had felt like a distant dream, overshadowed by the battles she had been fighting. But now, with the dust settling, the idea felt closer, like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Later that day, she brought the proposal to James. He was seated at his desk, poring over a report, but he looked up as she entered, a faint smile softening his usually serious expression. "Emma," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "What brings you in?" She placed the folder on his desk, her fingers brushing the cover as though hesitant to let it go. "I wanted to revisit this," she said. "It's a proposal for reopening the clinic in Silverbrook. I know it's a small project compared to some of the others, but I think it could make a real difference." James picked up the folder, flipping through the pages with a thoughtful expression. "Silverbrook," he mused, "your hometown." Emma nodded. "It's where I learned to care about people, where I saw what a lack of resources can do to a community. I think this is something we should do." James leaned back in his chair, his gaze resting on her. "You've been the heart of this foundation, Emma. If this is where your heart is, then I'll support it." Her breath caught, the weight of his words settling over her. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than I can say." The following weeks were a whirlwind of planning and coordination. Emma threw herself into the project, reconnecting with old friends and acquaintances in Silverbrook to gather their input. The excitement in the town was palpable, a reminder of how much good could come from a single spark of hope. One afternoon, as she stood on the clinic's long-abandoned steps, she found herself lost in thought. The peeling paint and cracked windows were a stark contrast to the vibrant memories she had of the place. a time when the clinic had been a lifeline for so many. She could almost hear her mother's voice, encouraging her to dream beyond the confines of their small town. "Penny for your thoughts." James's voice broke through her reverie. Emma turned to see him standing behind her, his hands in his coat pockets. "Just remembering," she said, her smile tinged with nostalgia. "It's strange to think how much this place shaped me." James stepped closer, his gaze following hers to the worn building. "It's not strange at all. The places that shape us always stay with us, no matter how far we go." Emma nodded, his words resonating deeply. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd have time." "For this," James said, a hint of humor in his tone. "I wouldn't miss it." They spent the rest of the afternoon touring the site, discussing plans for renovations and potential partnerships with local organizations. James's input was thoughtful and practical, but there was also a quiet respect in the way he listened to Emma's ideas, letting her take the lead. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in hues of gold and rose, Emma turned to James, her voice quiet but resolute. "I've always wanted to make a difference here, to give back to the place that gave me so much." James looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment before softening. "You already have, Emma, more than you know." The words stayed with her long after he had left, a quiet affirmation that she was on the right path. The clinic, once just a distant hope, was coming to life again, and with it a sense of purpose that felt deeply, unshakably hers. By the time she returned to the city, the plans were well underway. The foundation's support ensured that the project would have the resources it needed, but Emma also worked tirelessly to secure additional funding from local donors and community leaders. Every small victory, every step forward, brought her closer to the dream she had carried for so long. One evening, as she sat at her desk reviewing blueprints for the clinic's renovation, her phone buzzed with a message from Lily. "Saw the news about the clinic. You're doing amazing things, Em. So proud of you." Emma smiled, her heart full. She typed a quick reply. "It's a team effort. I couldn't have done it without people like you reminding me why this matters." As she set the phone down, she glanced at the blueprint again, her gaze lingering on the outline of the new reception area. It was a small detail, but one that carried a world of meaning, a space where people would feel cared for, welcomed, and valued. The clinic wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of everything she had fought for, a testament to the power of perseverance and the belief that even the smallest actions could create ripples of change. For the first time in years, Emma felt a sense of peace. She had found her place, not in the grandeur of the foundation's headquarters, but in the simple, enduring act of giving back to the community that had shaped her. The first phase of the Silverbrook Clinic's restoration began with an outpouring of support from the town's residents. The old building, with its peeling paint and sagging roof, stood as a symbol of both the struggles and the resilience of the community. To Emma, it was a testament to what could be achieved when people came together with shared purpose and hope. Work crews arrived early on a brisk Monday morning, their trucks filled with tools and materials. Emma stood on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, as she watched the workers begin to unload. She had spent weeks planning every detail of the project, from the layout of the waiting rooms to the placement of the new exam tables. Yet seeing the physical transformation begin filled her with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. A voice called out behind her, familiar and warm. "Emma, there you are." She turned to see Mrs. Abernathy, her former landlord, bundled in a thick coat and carrying a plate covered in foil. "I thought the workers might need some cookies," the elderly woman said with a smile. "And I thought you might need a little encouragement too." Emma felt a lump rise in her throat as she accepted the plate. "Mrs. Abernathy," You didn't have to. Nonsense, Mrs. Abernathy interrupted. This clinic means as much to us as it does to you. It's about time Silverbrook had something to be proud of again. The sincerity in her words struck a chord in Emma. She had always known the clinic was important, but hearing it from someone who had lived through the town's challenges gave her a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." Over the next few days, Emma split her time between managing the restoration and coordinating with local leaders. The town's mayor, a pragmatic woman named Ruth Lawson, had become one of Emma's strongest allies. Together, they worked to secure additional funding and ensure that the clinic would be equipped to meet the community's needs. "This isn't just about healthcare," Mayor Lawson said one afternoon as they reviewed the project's budget. "It's about reminding people that Silverbrook is worth investing in. You've given us something to believe in again, Emma." Emma smiled, though she felt the weight of the mayor's words. "It's not just me," she said. "It's everyone who's pitched in to make this happen." Still, as the days turned into weeks, Emma couldn't ignore the challenges that came with such a massive undertaking. Delays in shipments, unexpected repairs, and budget constraints tested her patience and resolve. There were moments when she wondered if she had taken on too much, but each time doubt crept in. She reminded herself of why she had started this journey. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma stood alone inside the partially restored clinic. The walls had been stripped bare, exposing the wooden beams beneath, and the air smelled of sawdust and fresh paint. She ran her hand along the edge of a new countertop, imagining the day when the clinic would be filled with life again, children laughing, families finding comfort, and neighbors reconnecting. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, and she turned to see James entering the building. He was dressed casually, his usual air of authority softened by the informal setting. "Thought I'd stop by and see how things are coming along," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "It's a work in progress," Emma replied, gesturing to the unfinished walls. "But it's getting there." James nodded, stepping closer. "You've done something remarkable here, Emma. I hope you realize that." She looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "It's not just about the clinic," she said. "It's about proving that change is possible, even in a place like Silverbrook." "And you've done that," James said, his voice steady. "Not just for the town, but for everyone who's been a part of this journey." Emma felt her cheeks flush at his praise, though she couldn't ignore the quiet pride swelling in her chest. "I couldn't have done it without your support," she said, "or the foundations." James smiled faintly. "You give me too much credit. This was always your vision, Emma. I just helped you bring it to life." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the past month settling between them. For all the challenges they had faced, there was a sense of quiet triumph in the air, a reminder that even the hardest battles could be won with determination and faith. As James prepared to leave, he turned to Emma, his expression thoughtful. "When this clinic opens, it's going to change lives. And it's because of you." Emma watched him go, her heart full. She had spent so much of her life wondering if she was capable of making a difference, but now she knew the answer. The clinic wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of resilience, a beacon of hope for a town that had weathered its share of storms. That night, as she returned to her small apartment, Emma sat by the window, gazing out at the quiet streets of Silverbrook. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had also been transformative. She had found strength she hadn't known she possessed, and she had discovered a purpose that went beyond her own ambitions. The clinic would open soon, and with it, a new chapter for Silverbrook, and for Emma herself. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace, knowing that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The grand opening of the Silverbrook Clinic dawned with a brilliance that seemed to reflect the joy and hope filling the town. The crisp morning air was tinged with the scent of freshly turned soil from the flower beds surrounding the building, now transformed into a space of light and warmth. Emma stood near the entrance, adjusting a ribbon tied across the double doors, her hands trembling slightly from a mixture of excitement and nerves. The crowd gathering in the square was larger than she had expected. Families with children, elderly couples wrapped in shawls, and even a few curious teenagers stood together, their faces bright with anticipation. Silverbrook's mayor, Ruth Lawson, approached Emma with a warm smile. "It's a good day for Silverbrook," Ruth said, her voice steady and sure, "and we have you to thank for it." Emma shook her head, smiling modestly. "It wasn't just me. So many people made this possible." "But it started with you," Ruth replied firmly. "Don't forget that." As the ceremony began, Emma took her place at the small podium set up in front of the clinic. The microphone crackled slightly as she adjusted it, her heart pounding as she faced the sea of expectant faces. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice carrying a warmth that belied her nerves. "This clinic is more than just a building. It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we come together as a community. It's about hope, resilience, and the belief that everyone deserves access to care and compassion." The crowd murmured its agreement, and Emma's confidence grew. She glanced over at Mrs. Abernathy, who stood near the front with her hands clasped tightly, her expression one of pure pride. "Silverbrook has always been a special place to me," Emma continued, her voice steady. "It's where I learned the value of kindness, the strength of community, and the importance of never giving up. I'm honored to give back to this town and to all of you who have given me so much." When she finished, the crowd erupted in applause, the sound echoing across the square. Emma stepped back, her cheeks flushed with emotion as Mayor Lawson took the podium to cut the ceremonial ribbon. The doors of the clinic swung open, and the crowd surged forward to explore the new space. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The waiting room, now bright and welcoming, was filled with people marveling at the transformation. The exam rooms gleamed with new equipment, and volunteers bustled about, offering tours and answering questions. Emma found herself surrounded by well-wishers, their words of gratitude and encouragement filling her heart to overflowing. Amid the celebration, Emma felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see James standing behind her, his expression one of quiet pride. He was dressed casually, his usual formality replaced with a warmth that matched the day's mood. "It's incredible," he said simply, gesturing to the bustling room. "You've created something truly special here." Emma smiled, her eyes misting. "We created it," she said. "I couldn't have done it without your support." James shook his head. "This was your vision, Emma. I just helped you bring it to life." They stood together for a moment, watching as children laughed and played in the waiting area, their parents chatting with volunteers. It was a scene of life and connection, a reflection of everything Emma had hoped the clinic would be. As the day went on, Emma found herself drawn into countless conversations, each one a reminder of the impact the clinic would have. Mrs. Abernathy introduced her to a young mother who had struggled to find affordable care for her children. The mayor pointed out an elderly man who had been instrumental in helping with the clinic's renovations. Everywhere she turned, Emma saw the faces of people whose lives would be touched by this place. Late in the afternoon, as the crowd began to thin, Emma slipped outside for a moment of quiet. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the square. She leaned against the railing of the clinic's steps, her heart full and her mind at peace. James joined her a few minutes later, his presence as steadying as ever. "You should be proud of yourself," he said, his voice low but full of meaning. This clinic is more than just a building. It's a testament to who you are. Emma looked at him, her expression thoughtful. I think it's a testament to what we all can be, she said, when we work together, when we believe in something bigger than ourselves. James nodded, his gaze distant for a moment before he turned back to her. What's next for you, Emma? The question lingered in the air, and Emma took a deep breath before answering. I don't know, she admitted. But for now, I just want to focus on making this clinic the best it can be. James smiled, a rare softness in his expression. I think you've already done that. As the evening deepened, Emma stayed on the steps, watching as the lights inside the clinic glowed warmly against the encroaching darkness. The day had been a celebration of the past, a recognition of the present, and a promise for the future. She felt no need to rush or plan ahead. For the first time in years, Emma allowed herself to simply be present, basking in the quiet satisfaction of a dream realized and a community renewed. The clinic was open, and with it, a new chapter had begun, for Silverbrook and for Emma herself. Several months had passed since the Silverbrook Clinic opened its doors, and the transformation within the town was evident. The once quiet streets now hummed with activity, the small businesses along Main Street thriving as more people visited the area. The clinic had become a cornerstone of the community, providing not only healthcare, but also a sense of hope and connection. Emma sat at her desk in the modest clinic office, reviewing a report on patient outreach. The numbers were promising. More families were accessing services than she had anticipated, and the community's response had been overwhelmingly positive. Yet, amidst her satisfaction, there was a lingering thought that she couldn't quite shake. A knock at the door broke her reverie, and she looked up to see Ruth Lawson, the town's mayor, stepping inside. "Busy as ever, I see," Ruth said with a smile, settling into the chair across from Emma. "There's always something to do," Emma replied, setting the report aside. "But I wouldn't have it any other way." Ruth nodded, her expression turning thoughtful. "You've done something remarkable here, Emma. This clinic has given Silverbrook a new sense of pride. People are talking about the future in a way they haven't in years." Emma smiled, though her mind drifted to the challenges that had come with building and sustaining the clinic. "It's been a team effort," she said, "and I'm grateful for everyone who's supported it." "Speaking of support," Ruth said, leaning forward slightly, "I heard that James Caldwell has been quietly involved in preserving the land surrounding the town. Do you know anything about that?" Emma's brow furrowed in surprise. "No, I didn't. What do you mean?" Ruth handed her a letter, the paper crisp and official-looking. "It came across my desk this morning. It seems James purchased the development rights to several parcels of land near the town. Instead of turning them into commercial properties, he's chosen to preserve them." Emma stared at the letter, her heart stirring with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. Why would he do that? Ruth shrugged, her smile knowing, "I think you know the answer to that better than anyone." After Ruth left, Emma sat alone with the letter, her thoughts swirling. She hadn't spoken to James much since the clinic's opening, their paths diverging as each focused on their respective responsibilities. Yet this gesture felt deeply personal, as though he had been quietly supporting her dream all along. The next morning, Emma found herself dialing James's number. She hesitated before pressing the call button, unsure of what she wanted to say. When he answered, his voice was warm and familiar, cutting through her doubts. "Emma," he said, "it's good to hear from you." "Hi, James," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. "I just heard about the land preservation near Silverbrook. I wanted to thank you." There was a pause on the other end, and when James spoke again, his tone was unassuming. It wasn't something I needed thanks for. It just felt like the right thing to do. But it means so much, Emma said earnestly. Not just to me, but to the entire town. You didn't have to do that. I know, James said simply, but Silverbrook is special, and so are the people in it. Emma's chest tightened at his words, the depth of his care for her and the community clear. Thank you, she said again, her voice quiet, for everything. After they hung up, Emma sat in her office, the weight of James's gesture settling over her. It wasn't just the land, it was the understanding behind it, the way he had recognized what Silverbrook meant to her and acted without expecting anything in return. In the weeks that followed, Emma saw the effects of James's decision ripple through the community. The preserved land became a haven for hiking trails and community gardens, spaces where families gathered and children played. It was another layer of the transformation Silverbrook had undergone, a testament to what could be achieved when people worked together with compassion and vision. One crisp autumn afternoon, Emma found herself walking one of the new trails, the leaves crunching beneath her boots as she admired the vibrant colors of the trees. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint scent of earth and pine. She paused at the top of a small hill, gazing out at the town below. From this vantage point, she could see the clinic, its windows glinting in the sunlight, and the bustling streets where life had returned in full force. She thought of her mother, of the lessons she had taught her about kindness and perseverance. She thought of the nights she had spent studying and dreaming, unsure if she would ever find her place. And she thought of James, whose quiet generosity had helped bring those dreams to life. The sound of footsteps behind her made her turn, and she wasn't entirely surprised to see James approaching. He wore a jacket against the chill, his hands in his pockets and a faint smile on his face. I thought I might find you here, he said, stopping a few steps away. Emma smiled. It's a good place to think. James nodded, his gaze sweeping over the town below. You've done something incredible here, Emma. Silverbrook is thriving because of you. It's not just me, Emma said. It's the people, the community. But you gave them something to believe in, James said, his voice steady. That's not something everyone can do. They stood in silence for a moment, the autumn breeze rustling the leaves around them. Emma felt a quiet peace settle over her, the weight of her journey balanced by the joy of what had been accomplished. As they walked back down the trail together, Emma felt a sense of connection to James, to Silverbrook, and to herself that was deeper and truer than anything she had ever known. Months passed, and the quiet rhythm of life in Silverbrook settled into something steady and sure. The clinic flourished under Emma's leadership, becoming a beacon of hope for the town and a source of pride for its residents. The preserved land surrounding Silverbrook, with its trails and community spaces, brought people together in ways Emma had only dreamed possible. One bright morning, Emma arrived at the clinic early. The sun had just begun its ascent, bathing the town in soft golden light. She unlocked the door, her steps familiar on the polished floors, and prepared for the day ahead. There was a calmness in her routine now, a sense of fulfillment that had replaced the restless uncertainty she once carried. As she settled into her office, a knock at the door drew her attention. One of the volunteers, a young woman named Grace, entered with an envelope in hand. "This just came for you," Grace said, her curiosity evident. Emma took the envelope, her name written in elegant script on the front. The handwriting was familiar, though it had been a while since she had seen it. She thanked Grace, waited for her to leave, and opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter from James. The paper was thick, the kind reserved for formal correspondence, but the words it carried were personal and heartfelt. Emma, I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to let you know that my work in Silverbrook is officially complete. The land preservation project has been finalized, and the deeds have been transferred to the town council. It belongs to the people now, as it should. I've spent much of my life chasing success, often at the expense of the things that truly matter. Working alongside you has reminded me of the importance of community, of roots, and of the quiet strength that comes from serving others. For that, I owe you more than I can express. I believe in what you've built here, Emma. It's a legacy that will endure, not just because of the clinic, but because of the spirit you've brought to this town. You've reminded all of us, myself included, that even the smallest actions can ripple outward and create lasting change. Though I'll be leaving Silverbrook, I won't forget what I've learned here. Thank you for showing me that there's more to life than what I once believed mattered most. With gratitude, Emma read the letter twice, her emotions shifting with every word. She felt a pang of sadness at the thought of James leaving, but also a deep gratitude for the role he had played in her journey. His words were a reminder of how far they had come, not just in their work, but in their understanding of themselves and each other. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, her mind turning to the impact James had left behind. His contributions had gone beyond financial support. They had been acts of faith in her and in the town she loved. That afternoon, Emma took a walk through the trails James had preserved. The paths wound gently through the trees, their leaves dappled with sunlight. Families strolled along the trails, children's laughter echoing through the woods. She passed a community garden where volunteers tended to neat rows of vegetables and flowers, the fruits of their labor, a testament to what could be accomplished when people came together. As she reached the top of a small hill, Emma paused to catch her breath. The view stretched out before her, the town, the clinic, the preserved land, all bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun. It was a view that spoke of resilience and renewal, of a place that had found its footing once more. She thought of James, of the quiet strength he had shown in supporting her vision without asking for recognition. His influence would remain woven into the fabric of Silverbrook, even as he moved on to the next chapter of his life. A voice called out behind her, and she turned to see Mrs. Abernathy making her way up the trail, a cane in hand, but a determined smile on her face. "Emma," she said, her voice warm, "I thought I might find you here." Emma helped the older woman to the bench at the top of the hill, where they sat together in companionable silence for a moment. "You've done a wonderful thing here," Mrs. Abernathy said finally, her tone full of pride. "The town hasn't felt this alive in years." "And it's because of you," Emma shook her head gently. "It's because of all of us," she said. "Silverbrook had the strength all along. It just needed a little help to find it." Mrs. Abernathy patted her hand. "Maybe so. But sometimes it takes one person to remind everyone else what's possible, and that person was you." Emma smiled, her heart full. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose, she felt a deep peace settle over her. The journey had been long and filled with challenges, but it had brought her to a place of purpose and connection. Silverbrook had found its second chance, and so had Emma. For the first time, she felt truly at home, not just in the town, but in herself. And as she sat there, watching the town she had helped rebuild, she knew that the future was bright, not because of what had been accomplished, but because of the strength and hope that would carry them forward. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.